Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this additional meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. May I extend a warm welcome to all members who may be online, to members of the public and to officers, some of whom are in the room and others who are online. And if I could now ask Mr. Hanton to run through the housekeeping notice, please, followed by items 1, 2 and 3 on the agenda. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council's website for a minimum of 6 months. Any councillors or officers not in the room and wishing to speak, please use the raise your hand feature and switch on your video when invited to speak. Please could members in the room only speak when invited to by the Chairman and mute microphones when not speaking. And finally, Chairman, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Then moving on to the main agenda, Chairman. Item 1, I've received just one apology from Councillor Brooke. Item 2, substitute members. Councillor David Brown has been appointed as a substitute for Councillor Brooke. And then moving on to item 3, Chairman, declarations of interest.
Members, are there any declarations? No, it doesn't appear there aren't. So could I take us now on to item 4 on the agenda, which is confirmation of the minutes of our meeting held on the 8th of September 2022. Councillor Cox.
I just want to report that I was present, but I was present online.
I'll ask Mr. Hanson to record that. Thank you, Councillor Cox. With that one addition, can you confirm that those minutes are a true and accurate record of the meeting that took place on the 8th of September? All agreed? Thank you very much indeed. Item 5 is public issues. Mr. Hanson?
Chairman, there are no public issues.
So to the agenda for this evening's meeting, I, in consultation with others, put together the 3 items that are before us this evening, and my hope and expectation is that we've got them in the right order so that they do tie into each other. The purpose is really for Audit and Governance to show that the governance issues are being properly looked at, are debated and have input from members where appropriate. So I've asked the officers to present on each of them. I anticipate presentations of about 15 minutes, maybe the first item as much as 20 perhaps, followed by questions. And we'll take the questions after each of the presentations. I think that will be probably a quicker and cleaner way of doing it. And so the first one will be an update on Corporate Risk 9, which is to maintain a safe and balanced budget for the delivery of services, which Mr. Richards, the Chief Financial Officer, will be presenting. The second is an update on Corporate Risk 13, the delivery of the transformation programme, and that will be made by the Chief Executive, Graham Farrant, supported by up to 3 officers who I think are online. And then finally, at item 8, we have Peter Barber, who's a partner in Grant Thornton, our external auditors, on the auditor's annual report 2020-21, and most specifically the value for money report. And in all 3 cases, I'd be grateful if members can stick to the governance issues, because that is the extent of our remit. I don't want to stray into other areas or into political areas, but I do want to make sure that we look very carefully at these governance issues. And that has really been the purpose of me bringing forward this additional meeting this evening. So I hope that we can work through it in the order I've suggested, and I hope that out of this we can all end up with a better idea of exactly where we are in terms of our governance across BCP Council. Councillor Howell.
Thank you. Yeah, you said that the report's going to be presented by officers, but the external auditor's report is a report in the name of Councillor Mellor. Is Councillor Mellor not going to be presenting that or speaking on it?
The intention is that our external auditors will be presenting. We have another audit and governance meeting on Thursday of next week, and what is the normal case is that Grant Thornton present on external audit issues. That's what we do. If Councillor Mellor is online and indicates, then I will invite him to speak. So, if I could take us now to item 6 on the agenda, which is the update on corporate risk 9 to maintain a safe and balanced budget for the delivery of services. And I'll hand over to Adam Richards, the Chief Financial Officer, to present. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. And as you said, the purpose of this presentation is to provide an update on corporate risk 9, the ability of the Council to maintain a safe and balanced budget for the delivery of services, because, as standing members of this committee will know, the monitoring of the corporate risk register is within the terms of reference of the Audit and Governance Committee. In starting this presentation, what I wanted to do was to recognise, I think, that probably...
Councillor Phipps.
Okay, is that better, Chair? Okay, so what I wanted to do was just first of all highlight the fact that I think probably and hopefully all members are aware of the financial challenges faced by BCP Council. We've seen a material change in the cost profile of the council, valued within the various reports at around about 25 million in 22-23, 30 million in 23-24. That is probably code for the cost of living crisis and the impact of the cost of living crisis on the council. We do consume significant amounts of energy costs, whether that's street lighting or in the provision of our buildings. We run numerous vehicles on a daily basis, on an hourly basis that need fuel. And clearly we've seen the impact of pay rises on the council and its overall fiscal impact. So we're not immune from the cost of living crisis of the council, and that is something that has materially impacted during the course of this year. On top of that, we've seen some changes to the flexible use of capital receipt statutory guidance, which left the council with a significant shortfall in funding of its approved transformation programme. Subsequent to that, we issued an application under the government's exceptional financial support programme for a capitalisation direction, with a response from the Minister of State for the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Community, the Minister Paul Scully, to offer the council a £20 million Mind to decision in early September. Hopefully that is something that all members of this committee and council is aware of. But in saying all of that, I think it's fair to say, yes, we have financial challenges, but as a sector, particularly caused by the first of those issues, the whole sector has problems. In the sense that, this slide I put together a couple of weeks ago from some of the headlines that were being circulated at that time, and since then I could probably fill 4 or 5 more slides of some of the announcements in the press of various local authorities and their own fiscal challenges. You can see that Dorset Council have identified a £20 million gap in next year's budget. You can see that Cornwall are talking about £62 million projected overspend. You can see that both districts and county councils are all impacted and issuing early warnings around the impact on their council and how they respond to it. The one I didn't put on the slide was Thurrock, because I probably could fill 3 or 4 slides by Thurrock alone. They've applied under the Exceptional Support Programme for an £836 million government loan to address the problems that that individual council has. So, you know, a lot of stress, financial stress within the whole local authority sector at this moment in time. And to be fair to this council, when it came to the cost of living, you know, we were meeting regularly with Cabinet during June, April and May, which led into the June report that enabled us to put in an early mitigation strategy that then has led into some of the other financial challenges that have then actually been identified and articulated and helped in the overall response as part of that process. But I do want to emphasise that although all local authorities are suffering from the cost of living crisis, we do have some specific issues regards to BCP Council. Most salient amongst those is our transformation investment programme. We have a transformation investment programme which led us to apply for a capitalisation direction of £76 million. We have £20 million of that looking for government support in 22-23 and looking for further government support in the following 2 years. You know, and that therefore then led to the offer from the Department of Levelling Up in early September of a £20 million capitalisation direction minded to decision, you know, for the council to consider as part of its overall fiscal management. On top of that, besides having to fund that transformation programme and having identified that our original funding strategy was no longer available to us, which was securitisation of beach huts, what we also have to recognise is the council's reserve position. Because the council's reserve position, as this slide demonstrates, as at the 31st of March 2022, was around about total reserves just under £130 million. That included both unearmarked reserves and earmarked reserves. Unearmarked reserves are our, what I call rainy day money, you know, actually, you know, just, you know, to cover us for those unforeseen circumstances, where earmarked reserves are set aside for specific purposes. And in those earmarked reserves, what we've got is at least £40 million of government grants. Because, you know, years and years and years ago, government grants that we didn't use at year end didn't feed into our reserves. The government changed the rules. That meant that actually any government grants we didn't use, they feed into our earmarked reserves as part of that equation. So they're not really for us and available to us, you know, that £40 million to use, because we have to normally spend it in line with the grant conditions that the government issued to us. The other thing to recognise in that £114 million is there's £36 million of support to the 22-23 budget as part of that equation. So we have to recognise that a lot of that money is earmarked for a specific purpose. If we looked at, therefore, at the unearmarked reserves, you can see that there is a £700,000 contribution to them in each of the years of our medium-term financial plan, with an intention of increasing them from the current level of £15.3 million to £18.8 million by the time we get to the 31st of March 2027. I have been asked the question, what were they when actually BCP Council came into being? And on the 1st of April 2019, we had £17.4 million in unearmarked reserves. The other thing to really highlight as part of this presentation is the position for the the end of 2022-23 financial year, and as we move into 23-24, because you can see in the fourth column that our total reserves at the 31st of March 2024 will be £30.6 million. The deficit on our dedicated schools grant, whether we look at it optimistically or pessimistically, will be more than our total reserves in that year. As it stands in that situation, I would have to issue a Section 114. Currently, there is a piece of legislation that allows us to ignore that deficit with regards to requirement to set a balanced budget, taking account of the reserve position. That piece of legislation is due to expire on the 31st of March 2023. So therefore, you could say, you know, everything as presented, we get into a very difficult position in 23-24. However, from my conversations with government, there seems to be a growing consensus that they will extend that legislation, at least for potentially up to another 3 years, to allow local authorities and the Department for Education to go through the process of actually working out what the solution to that growing deficit in the dedicated schools grant due to the high needs block actually is by way of a direction. So, having recognised the fact that we are very similar to other local authorities in having cost of living pressures, that we have some specific issues that are pertinent to the council, be that the funding of our transformation programme or our low level of reserves, that brings us on to the work that Cabinet have been doing with regards to aiming to set a balanced budget for 23-24. Because you will remember, as part of the conditions of the £20 million was that we have or are able to present a balanced budget position at the end of September for the 23-24 financial year. And through the conversations with the department, that was regarded as a report we take to Cabinet in October, not the report we took on the 28th of September, because we took 2 reports in September. So looking at that medium-term financial plan funding gap, in 23-24, on the 7th of September, we started with a £36.4 million gap. When we roll forward to the 28th of September, it reduced to a £16.4 million gap. And the reason it reduced is because the council had completely changed and updated its financial strategy. Gone was the reliance on no commercial models in order to balance the 23-24 budget. As part of the conditions of the 92 decision, that was all centred on conventional, traditional local authority approaches to local government finance. So, that September report updated the financial strategy, and what it said is, a number of areas to look at with regards to the activity to bring us into that balanced position. The first of those was the financial outturn for 22-23, with a real emphasis on work being undertaken to create and increase the surplus for 22-23. Way back on the 8th of September, we had a potential £2.1 million deficit forecast for 22-23. By the time we got to the 28th of September, that had turned into a surplus of £4.1 million. When we roll forward to October and the report that goes to Cabinet next week, that will increase further to £7.8 million. And as part of that, one of the things that we've done is we put a, if you like, a freeze on any new financial commitments until such time as a balanced budget for 23-24 is delivered, not necessarily identified, is delivered. And that means that that control will stay in place, as I understand it, up until and including the budget paper for 23-24, because at that stage it becomes agreed that we'll implement, do the difficult thing necessary in order to formally balance that budget. So that's the first element of the strategy, a real strive on trying to apply the brakes gently this year and create those resources. The second element is the element that Graham and some colleagues will talk about next, which is a transformation programme. Absolutely looking at that programme and saying, is there any expenditure in there that is nice to have, so that is focused on what is absolutely essential to deliver the change necessary in order to deliver the benefits that we want. And besides that, to challenge the profile of that expenditure, because if you can take some money out of those early years and put it into the latter years, it gives you more time to respond effectively and work out what those financial strategies are. The third element of the strategy was to look at non-strategic asset disposals to create an additional potential receipts to fund transformation in 23-24 and 24-25, valued at somewhere between 26.8 and 46.8. That was a proposal that was essential, or in essence, what was described in the 28th of September Cabinet report. Next week's Cabinet report takes it further, because next week's cabinet report says that they want the organisation to consider the extent to which we can bring forward additional asset sales into 22-23 to avoid the capitalisation direction being taken in 22-23. So code for, can we deliver £20 million asset sales in this financial year to avoid the capitalisation direction? And that's the work stream that's now been kicked off as a result of that October report going forward to Cabinet next week. Alongside that, there's an accommodation strategy with a real focus on coming out of a number of satellite buildings where you have administrative tasks being performed, and for those staff to be transferring into the Civic Hub or some of the library hubs that have been created in various locations. And that will enable us to potentially sell those buildings if they're no longer required, subject to them we owning the freehold. But also alongside that, obviously reduce the running costs of those buildings. If we're not able to sell them, at least we'll be able to reduce the running costs of them. The next element was then looking at commercial opportunities, opportunities to generate additional revenue through a more commercial mindset, and some of that will pick up some of the learning that we've done through the securitisation of Beach Hut's work stream. The next area was looking at our staff costs. Looking at the fact that we underspent our staff costs for 21-22 more than we anticipated, because actually the time between a post becoming vacant and it being filled is generally longer than anticipated, and that leads to what's referred to as a vacancy drag being bigger than we expected. And recognising that in our budgets going forward, so we're not seen as over budgeting as part of the approach. Alongside that, reviewing all vacant posts to see if they can be permanently deleted or removed, limiting the use of agency employees, and looking at a programme of bringing forward apprenticeship programmes to support the organisation into the future. So those were the first elements of the financial strategy. We then looked at enabling the council to consider a strength-based approach to its assets, i.e. better community ownership and management of those assets than is currently in place. Looking at investor save proposals, bringing forward robust business cases that might use the council's ability to borrow by investing, and that investing driving down operational costs and covering the costs of that borrowing. Doubling back on our harmonisation of services to make sure that all our services across BCP are delivered to the same standard, no matter what area of the conurbation they are delivered within, because there are still elements of differences. With regards to the integrated care system, that's having that conversation with the NHS colleagues with regards to determining how the two organisations can work more effectively together to drive down costs of the overall system, either benefiting the council or the NHS, but hopefully both as part of that analysis. Then the normal ones are reviewing your earmark reserves, reviewing any third-party balances, considering the extent to which we could capitalise legitimately in line with the legislation, any costs being incurred by the organisation, and then reviewing the council's collection fund. All traditional, all conventional approaches to the council's financial strategies. And that was, agreed as part of that report to Cabinet in early September, and we've gradually started to build up a work stream that enables us to move forward. In addition to those I mentioned, there was also potentially lobbying at government around the possibility of support for the cost of living, and to potentially allow us to amend statutory fees and charges where they remain at the same level for probably decades, to say, can we just bring those up? And then the last one on the list, because it traditionally is the last one on the list, is looking at service rationalisations, reductions, considering the extent to which discretionary services need to be provided, and where we provide statutory services, considered if they're provided above the statutory minimum, potentially what options that provides us as a council. or conventional or traditional kinds of approaches. So that leads into a report that's going to Cabinet next week. The report to Cabinet next week identifies that, through that diligent work that's been undertaken with Cabinet and the positive response that's been taken, we've had weekly meetings between Cabinet and Corporate Management Board. As I say, the focus has been on traditional and conventional approaches and taking responsibility of doing the right things in the right way at the right time. All of that means that report will identify that we have on paper a balanced budget for 23-24. And various different impacts on the medium-term financial plan, and overall over the 4-year period funding gap of 11.1. But let's be clear what's behind some of those, some of those issues, in the sense that that medium-term financial plan is making provision for £53 million worth of cost pressures and service pressures and growth demand pressures next year due to the cost of living, due to inflation, due to pay and reward. It's making allowance for about £10.4 million of additional resources. That's a 2.99% council tax increase. That's the increases that we've received in our tax base, and that's then adjusted for the movements on our reserves, because we recognise that the £36 million that's been supporting 22-23 has to come out, but then we can put some more in because of the better than anticipated outturn for this year and for last year, all feeding into that process. It then includes £38 million of additional savings, efficiencies, fees and charges, service reductions. And that brings us to a position of £4.6 million. And then what we've done is identify some further potential savings and efficiencies that would then take us to zero. But the reason why those are below the line, because those are considered the reductions that would probably be the most painful. We don't really want to go there, but if we have to, then there's that overall commitment to ensuring that we remain balanced as part of the overall process. So that's the report that's going to Cabinet next week. I think it's only right and proper, as part of the review of the corporate risk register, and the essence of the presentation is then to review the risks. Because the first risk associated with where we are will be around the deliverability of those savings. What we have to do now is to ensure that, yes, we might have identified those savings, efficiencies, fees and charges, reduction changes, and service reductions, but now we've got the hard work delivering them. It's painful enough to identify them, but clearly it's going to be quite resource hungry and demanding of the organisation to then move them forward to that delivery stage, and that will engage and be necessary to engage both the employees and the public in various levels of consultation. As part of that, we have to recognise we are assuming that we'll deliver £42.6 million of overall savings in 23-24, 16% of our net revenue expenditure. 32.4 million of them have been scheduled, and we recognise that 4.6, although scheduled, are definitely more challenging. We're including in that overall 42.6 is £9.6 million of itemised transformation savings. Itemised in respect to the fact that they've been associated with third-party spend savings. The task is to now identify which budgets we're going to then reduce because of those third-party spend savings. And Graham might want to reflect on that in a minute. The last one is we've got £0.6 million currently unidentified in children's, because we've, in the budget for February 2022, placed a restriction on adults and children's growth in each year of the medium-term financial plan, 2.99. Adults, as part of the process, have identified all of those. Children's have identified the most significant majority of those. There's just a little bit more for them to do as part of that process. So that's risk one, delivering those assumptions, delivering those savings. The next risk to me is uncertainty. I think I quoted before as saying the only certainty at this moment in time is uncertainty. Currently, there are high levels of financial planning unpredictability caused by the cost of living crisis, caused by constant changes and variations in the cost of goods, materials and services that this council requires to deliver its operations. So we're going to have to keep that constant vigil on how things are changing and how they change, and keep taking the actions to ensure that we remain within balance. The next item of risk is that capitalisation direction or asset sales. We've made that commitment now to looking and determining the feasibility of bringing forward £20 million of non-strategic asset sales by the 31st of March to avoid drawing down the capitalisation direction. As part of the minded to decision, we recognise that we're undertaking an external finance and governance review. That will happen regardless of whether we take capitalisation direction or not. And clearly, with that level of scrutiny comes potential reputational risk as part of the overall assessment. Next risk is the one that I always mention, and I mentioned already tonight, is that accumulating deficit on the dedicated schools grant, and working with DFE to work out what that solution is, because there needs to be a solution, because it is snowballing with regards to its overall impact on the council's financial position. The next risk is in that funding strategy we've adopted for BCP future places, in the sense that they will get paid based on successful business cases brought forward to the council for approval. And what we'll do is, when they bring forward those successful business cases, we'll then make payments to them for the work they've done, and that will be capitalised as part of the project then adopted by council. We've provided them with an £8 million working capital loan. That's equivalent to 50% of our unutilized reserves. So therefore there is that real emphasis on the need for them to work smart, to work effective, and bring forward business cases that are viable and the council can approve. The next risk is probably one of the most significant risks, really, and that's the social care reforms. In the sense that these reforms will levy significant new responsibilities on local authorities, as well as introducing a cap on care costs. The 23-24 MTFP position assumes the cost of these reforms will be about £12.8 million. So that's the cost we're associating with those reforms. We're making the assumption the government will give us £12.8 million to cover the cost that we're going to face. But no details of those grants have actually been released. There's no promises to that effect. So, we need to keep that under constant review, because if there is a gap between the two, we're going to be exposed. And we know from learning around SEND that gaps between the two can occur on these major reforms introduced by government. So there's significant risk that the government grant will be insufficient to cover the full costs associated with the reforms. The final one is potential public spending reductions. The Chancellor's announcement of plans for the public finance is due on the 31st of October 2022. At the moment, I think it's fair to say there are different views as to whether the spending plans that were set out in the spending review of 2021, the 23-24 and 24-25, will be continued with, or whether they'll be altered. I don't think I could call it. I think there are too many different views at this moment in time. We just need to wait and see what the Chancellor brings on the 31st of October. But what we do know is from the indications that should spending cuts be implemented, then local government would not be protected from those reductions. So that's something for us to be aware of, mindful of, and to keep vigilant to as part of that overall process. Hopefully, Chair, that gives you an overview of the Council's financial position, an overview of the risks associated with that position, and hopefully feeds into that ability of the Council to keep a safe and balanced budget, both for this year and with a weathered eye on future years as well. Happy to take questions, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Richards, and thank you for sticking to time with such a comprehensive presentation. Could I also just mention a couple of things before I take questions? The first of which is to thank Councillor Phipps for the nudge to send out some background papers, which I think I did 10 days or so ago with your help, Mr. Richards. So all members will have had those, obviously with the exception of Councillor Brown. You'll be familiar with them anyway. I suppose the most pertinent one is the most recent, which is the Finance Strategy Update report of the 28th of September. I hope that all other members have had the opportunity to read through those reports to refresh, because there has been an awful lot of background information which obviously in the presentation can't possibly come forward. So I don't know whether anybody's in a position to forward that. It was an email of the 9th of October.
Chair, clearly in addition to those papers that were sent at that time, you've got the cabinet report that's going next week.
Indeed,
that provides that even further
indeed. So
updates.
it's a moving situation, always is in finance, particularly in these circumstances. But I wanted to make sure and thank Councillor Phipps for giving that nudge so that every member's had that opportunity.
Yeah, Chair, if I can just mention the fact that commitment to the monthly financial updates remains, despite us getting to that zero position, it remains. And I can see it lasting up until including the budget report that's included to consent to council consideration next February. So monthly reports just to keep that eye on those risks and to ensure that we maintain that balanced position.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Richardson. So for our purposes in audit and governance, as I said at the beginning, it's about corporate risk 9. And Mr. Richards has run through 6 or maybe 7 headlines where he feels that we are likely to be the most exposed, and therefore the issues which we need to look at the most keenly through this committee's work, rather than the wider budget issues, as if those weren't sufficient on their own. And if I could ask Mr. Hampton to keep an eye on those online who may wish to intervene with questions, but I will take questions from the committee who are here present in the room first, starting with Councillor Phipps.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to Adam. I did receive some answers to questions I sent you today, but I really haven't had a chance to look at those before the meeting. So if I'm asking something again, I apologise. I'd just like to ask about the transformation programme, which I do see as quite a risk. It appears to me it's not really achieving. Originally, the KPMG report said it was going to cost about 30 million. Now it's risen overall to about 67 million, I think it is, and the benefits seem to be the same and they're all delayed. So basically we're spending twice as much, getting the same savings, but they're coming in later. And every year you don't get the money that you thought you were going to get, then it's situation, we've kind of lost that, and the situation's getting a bit worse. So it does seem to me it's quite a risk. I wonder if you could explain why the costs have risen so much, but the benefits haven't changed, and how that is affecting, how it's actually costing the council. I do have some other questions. Do you want me to give you another one as well, or just the one?
I'll come back to you after this one, although obviously some of this spills over into our next presentation from the Chief Executive. However, in terms of a balanced budget and a sustainable budget, the questions you ask are hugely pertinent to corporate risk 9 as well.
Yeah, in the sense that, clearly as part of the next presentation, the Chief Exec might want to make reference to that comment. But regards to setting a balanced budget for next year, what I continue to look for is the evidence base around the delivery of those savings, the evidence base to support the assumptions of the savings. So for this example, we have a target of £10 million additional savings next year from third-party spend as part of that transformation programme. So, the Chief Executive probably bored of me keep mentioning the fact that we need that evidence, we need that momentum to ensure that we are delivering those savings and efficiencies, so that come February we can be pretty assured that everything's in place to ensure their delivery as part of that overall consideration. With regards to this year, I think it's a target of £8.7 million in year. What we recognise is actually we've done relatively well, in the sense that we've delivered a significant amount of those savings. I think we're identifying potential shortfall of about just over £1 million or so. But that constant work to try and deliver that full target is there, and that momentum. So sometimes it's easy to look at what we haven't achieved, also, I think we need to sometimes reflect the other way around and look at what we have achieved, because we have achieved probably at least 80 to 90% of the figure and target we set ourselves for the year. But probably something for the Chief Executive to reflect on as part of the next presentation as well.
Is that all right for the time being, Councillor Phipps? Because I think if we don't get them muddled, that will help us.
Yeah.
But clearly there are implications on the balanced outturn for this year and the medium-term financial year from next year onwards. But I think we want to hear presently from the Chief Executive about the delivery and the timeliness of that delivery of transformation savings going forward. You had some other questions.
I'll just go. You've already sort of spelt out quite a bit about the dedicated schools grant, and that appears to be quite a high risk indeed. Basically, if the regulations aren't continued, we could be in dire straits with that. Is there a plan B, or we're just in that situation that if the regulations aren't extended, you would have to issue a 114 notice and that's it? Is there a plan B?
Well, the first thing to emphasise is that we wouldn't be alone in that lifeboat, in the sense that there are a huge amount of local authorities up and down the country in a very similar position to this council, and probably some even worse as part of that process. So this is a national debate. I certainly met with DLUC, put some pressure on them with regards to the extension of those regulations. We did a bit of work with other local authorities to try and produce the evidence base. My understanding is that evidence base has landed, and it is likely, I couldn't promise it, I couldn't guarantee it, but it is likely that those regulations will be extended. That should hopefully allow this council, because we're part of the Delivering Better Value in SEND programme, to continue the conversation that we're having with DLUC and with the people that are supporting DLUC as part of that programme, to establish and ensure that we're doing all the right things in the right way at the right time with regards to managing that overall cost of SEND. But a lot of this goes back to what was it, 2014? The government put in a piece of legislation that for a low funded council with regards to its education at that time, almost created that little bit of a time bomb. As the demands increased, as children come through the system, then actually the costs have increased, but the funding's not kept pace with that. And that's that is only going to continue as set out in that medium-term financial plan. The figures might slightly change. Hopefully they'll improve a little bit. But this is an issue. This is a national issue, and we need governments to provide a national solution.
So could I just piggyback onto the point that you've raised, because it is about outcomes and understanding where we're going, and I'm wondering at what level representation is being made jointly and collectively with other similar local authorities, presumably through local government association first and foremost, because it strikes me, as I'm sure it does others, that the financial pressure that the government is facing would indicate that those that make the most noise will at least get some attention, I would hope, and this DSG high needs budget issue isn't going to go away for a whole raft of local authorities, and a section 114 across much of local government won't do anybody any good. So I'm just wondering whether we are fully playing our part in making those representations to help, because the situation, as elsewhere, is getting away from us and is not going to be compensated by reserves, because as we've heard, they would be inadequate to cover the shortfall. Mr. Richards?
Thank you, Chair. As far as I'm aware, everybody that's part of that process is using all the forums available to them to potentially undertake that lobbying. So for me, things like military treasurers, we mentioned the LGA, I'm sure the Chief Exec through his forums, and clearly members through their conversations with government, both formally and informally, as part of that process, I'm sure we'll be making representation to government, and similarly the Director of Children's Services through their approaches. And we seem to have Ofsted in here quite a lot, and clearly when they turn up, it's a subject matter that we draw constantly draw their attention to.
Is there anything else, Councillor?
I do have those, but I think perhaps go to someone else and I'll come back later.
Okay. Waiting for somebody else to indicate. Oh, Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, I think I'd welcome the review that you talked about that was going to be needed with or without the capitalisation directive. I think that would be very useful. I do feel that that there seems to be a sort of a Trusky and a volte-face in terms of our finances. We seem to have gone from Kwasi Kwarteng to Jeremy Hunt in terms of the way we're approaching matters, certainly from a political perspective, not from an officer perspective, because it seems to be completely changed, and I certainly welcome a lot of the direction which you're taking the council at the moment, because it's quite clearly we're quite clearly in a very dangerous position, serious position, and it needs grown-ups at the table to actually sort it out those. So I do welcome that. I have a question though in terms of the council tax that we forgone at the last election. How much was that? Can you remind me? I have it. I know I've got it somewhere, but I can't remember.
I think off the top of my head, I think that's probably one that I'm going to need to come back to in regards to the exact amount foregone. Because it depends on what financial year you're looking at.
Just last year. Because what we know is last year, we set a council tax of 4%, which was 1% plus the 3% social care precept. Sorry, it was 0%.
No, what did we do last year? We set 0 plus 4%, when we could have increased it by 1.9% plus the 4%. So we basically went on, in part of that year, equivalent of about 2%, which is equivalent to about £4 million.
Which, funnily enough, is the amount that we're just about to have to dig into the services that are going to seriously affect the residents of this BCP council. You're talking about £4 million, and if we had not foregone that council tax increase, we wouldn't have to. Those people would not have to be suffering the prospect, at least, of serious cuts in presumably things like children's services and adult social care services, which will be very hard on not just the people that are having to suffer it, but also the people who are having to deliver it as well.
I suppose there's two parts of that response to that. First of that was for me wearing my Section 151 hat to say that as part of my Section 25 report, I suggested an alternative strategy to the budget, which included maximising that council tax, because I felt it would better protect the council going forward. However, I think, to be fair to the administration, bird in hand, and Bush kind of phrase comes to mind in regards to that meant actually during the course of this year, council taxpayers haven't had to pay the amount they would otherwise have to do, and therefore they would have derived the benefit from that. It's all about those differing priorities, but
the people that will be suffering the cuts in the services will not be the people that have had that benefit of that council tax freeze. That's the point I'm trying to make. Is that it's grossly unfair and disproportionate as to who's suffering, who will be suffering at the hands of that decision. And I'm not blaming you, because you actually quite rightly pointed that out to us, and we ignored it. And the point I'm trying to make here is a governance issue, is that we have, as a council and as a committee, failed to hold the administration to account for the decisions that are being made, because we're now in this position, and therefore it's this committee, because we're responsible for governance and risk, as you quite rightly pointed out, and we did not do enough to get to stop this situation arising in the first place.
Well, I think since you are looking at me and pointing at me at the same time, I'm not sure that we failed, Councillor Cox, because the administration will have led on budget proposals and taken them through council in the way that they did, and we don't have the power to prevent that. But at the same time, I do agree with you, having myself taken through the former Bournemouth Council some 12 budgets. I know how it works, and I know how much holding to account can be taken into account. So I understand the point you're making, but I don't think the responsibility can be laid at the door of this committee, other than that we have considered it. And one of the reasons for bringing these 3 items forward this evening, just for complete clarity, is that I alone felt that we should be looking at these in the round, independently of the administration, and on the terms of our remit around governance issues for the council, which is why we're doing it tonight. But I think we need to be careful as to whose responsibility it is ultimately to make those changes.
I agree with you in part. It is the responsibility of the administration who make the changes, but it's our responsibility to hold them to account and to point out the risks that they're going into, and make recommendations as to how they may change them. And I feel certainly with this committee and other committees that we've made precious few recommendations that have been voted through for Cabinet to consider. Not that it would have paid a slight blind bit of notice, I have to say, but there you go. Can I just ask one question which is slightly different, and it's to do with the DSG grant as well, and as it's really that a lot of councils have already gone down this track and have already made negotiations with the government, and I know particularly because Hillingdon, which is an authority I know quite a bit about, and still got contacts there, they have come to a settlement with the government on DSG, which means that they have had to contribute to the deficit, and if they've contributed as well as other authorities, what presumably the government are going to go along similar tracks with every other council. They're not going to write it off. They're going to insist that we contribute towards it. They may contribute a bit to it, but we will have to put something towards it. And on that basis, should we not be doing an assessment as to what we are likely to have to contribute?
Restrictions. I think in response to that, I think I'm clear that every local authority that have been through that safety valve mechanism have made a different outcome to their negotiation with government. I don't think there are two that are exactly the same. I think as part of those conversations, as best as I understand them, there is recognition as to the council's financial health or financial positions, part of the negotiations, and where contributions have been sought, they've not necessarily been contributions from reserves that they built up. In some instances, it's by way of future contributions that they then have to build into their future financial planning as part of that process. In some instances, it's both, as part of those equations. What I am hopeful for is that as we go through the delivering better value in SEND work stream, we've gone through phase 1, phase 2, hopefully we start to get into a position where we can have some clarity around those issues, and clearly we've then got hopefully something more substantial to then factor into our medium-term financial plan or budget processing if that is indeed necessary as part of that process. So that process I think is due to conclude probably towards the end of November. Hopefully that gives us some clarity as to how this might eventually develop into the future.
Thanks very much, Adam, for that. But I do strongly believe that we should be planning ahead and making and assessing what has been done, because even if it's just getting an average of what the settlements have been, what arrangements have been made, that will give us an indication on average what we might have to be looking at.
The only thing I'm conscious of is that the regulations that currently stand prevent us from making any contribution into a reserve that almost offsets that pressure. So something we need to just keep working through the government. Yeah.
I'm not suggesting any contributions. I'm just suggesting that we are aware. We know what that risk is going to be. And as we're here talking about risk, this is a risk, and if we can measure that risk, that's all for the better.
Councillor Howell.
Thank you, Chair. My first question relates to earmarked reserves. Are you able to give indication as to what proportion of earmarked reserves are actually committed
for example, through contracts and can't be avoided, and what proportion is actually in relation to projects that we want to complete, but you know that the money's earmarked for them in those reserves, but that we could withdraw from.
I think, as a standard response, that's probably quite difficult to give you that level of information, and I'll probably explain why. Earlier, I think I suggested that significant amount of our earmarked reserves relates to government grants. So if we don't spend the money, then we potentially have to return it to government as part of those grant conditions. And we know of the £114 million we had at the 31st of March 2022, at least 40 million of that related to government grants that would potentially need to be returned as part of that process. What we then know on top of that, a significant proportion of those earmarked reserves are money set aside to support either the 22-23 budget or now the 23-24 budget. So it's not committed, other than we committed it to our financial strategy as part of that process. The third major chunk of those earmarked reserves are reserves that we hold as the accountable body. So there are a number of joint committees, joint arrangements, where we actually hold the money on behalf of those organisations. So whether that's the Stour Valley Import Partnership, whether that's the Education Music Service, whether that's the Archives, whatever they are, we hold reserves on behalf of those third parties. So it's not within our governance to decide what actually happens to them. It would be for the relevant board, the governance forum, to decide what actually happens.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, maybe the Democratic officer could put up that sheet about the earmarked reserves, but because they obviously going down very substantially from next year to the following year. I mean, how much is, if you take away the amount that the government's not going to allow us to use for anything else, you take away the earmarked reserves that we are looking after for other people, then what do you subtract that from the 114, and what do you get?
Well, if you took off £40 million, that is government, you took off £36 million of that was supporting the 23-24 budget. You took off probably another, off the top of my head, probably £20 million supporting the 23-24 budget, getting down to relatively small figures, other than what remains, which is that £13.9 million thereabouts on an ongoing basis.
But that is less than the liability to the DSGs.
Yeah, and that's the point I raised with regards to risk. When you roll forward into 23-24, you're going to be in a position where your total reserves, whether that be earmarked or unearmarked, is less than your accumulated deficit on that reserve. And as we've discussed, actually, based on, if you like, current requirements, you would be in section 4 in that position.
But surely, what you seem to be saying is that the DSG commitment is greater than the amount of money that we have in reserves that we can freely use, and therefore surely we're in a section 114 position already under that logic.
You're not at this moment in time, because there's a statutory override that allows that deficit on the dedicated schools grant to be ignored for the purposes of the equation of coming to that judgment. Now that's not the case when we move into 23-24 financial year, but the good indications are that legislation will be extended.
Okay, so it's extended year by year. That's
well,
the reason
no. We expect it to extend it probably for up to a 3-year period, but I couldn't give members any guarantee on that. That's all potentially, what's potentially been discussed. But until it's actually laid, but what we recognise, the risk if it's not laid, then us and another number of other local authorities are going to be needing to have some very serious and prompt conversations with government.
Okay, thank you. Just very quickly, don't want to go on too long, but I'm just wondering, given the likelihood of further cuts being imposed on us by Jeremy Hunt in 2 weeks' time, if he's still the Chancellor in 2 weeks' time, then you know, would you be, well, clearly you don't know. Clearly, I would suggest you then say that this is something you never get an indication of in advance. But, you know, are you able to say that if you are prudent, you should be building in that expectation into your short-term calculation? And then the second question was in relation to the various savings that have been identified, and you split them into the two categories. First lump and then the 4.6 million, which was the really hard cuts. If you've identified the really hard cuts, to do that, you must surely have identified the specific cuts that are in the slightly less hard categories. So, you know, to what level of detail have you done that? Do the services know what areas specifically they have to cut, and have they identified those cuts, or are they just being told, a department's being told, you've got to save X money?
So, two questions there. In regards to what's coming our way on the 31st of October, at this moment in time, I think, as I said in the presentation, there are differing views as to what will happen on the 31st of October. One is potentially that there might be further pain by way of government grant reductions, but I'd be interested to understand from the government how they would actually implement that, because we get about £3 billion of revenue support grants, so they're not a huge sum for them to potentially take out of the council, but that doesn't stop them changing the business rate system and taking out more. So, at this moment in time, I think it's that little bit about realism. It might go up, it might go down. It's about 11 days away. Probably best to wait to see what that says before we then respond. Coming on to your second point, however, I think it's that recognition that Cabinet have done a huge amount of work with officers, that's with corporate management team, and that's with the services that then feed into that process with regards to identifying, the savings and efficiencies, the additional income, the additional resources in order to support, the £38 million of savings that have been achieved from those service areas as part of that process. It is not Adam Richards has decided X for this service, X for that service, and we've got target. This is about, for me, it's quite important. There's that deliverability there. We've done that process. We've identified where those issues might be, how they might be, what they might relate to, and now we're at the stage where we move into that implementation stage. If any of those need consultation, we will need to go through that process, whether that be with stakeholders, employees, or the public. We will go through that process and engaging it. But Cabinet have done a huge amount of diligent, responsible, hard work in identifying the list of savings efficiencies that will be needed in order, taking this more traditional, conventional approach to deliver that balanced budget for 23-24. As one member's already recognised, that is a shift from where we were previously.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've got a few comments and then just a couple of questions I'll come on to in a minute. I know the questions have been asked already, but nobody's really talked about what the report says overall, really. And I've been involved either sitting on audit committees or attending them in my various roles for 15 years now. And reading the external auditor's recommendations and the red flags, it's just frankly shocking, really, with where this council's got to, particularly compared to where the previous Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch councils were, and their responsible, prudent financial management of those previous authorities. It's just shocking to read. I've never seen so many red warnings around significant weaknesses around financial sustainability. I've never seen so many recommendations and urgency to take remedial action to deal with them. And I congratulate Adam and his team in developing a strategy to try and address the significant issues that we now face. It's been mentioned there's a sort of shift now to more traditional approaches to managing it, which is good to see and it's great, but in my book it's over a year too late really for that. We've created this hole and now we're having to sort of go back to the way we should always have been trying to manage these finances. For me, in terms of governance issues, for me, one of the fundamental flaw in the governance issue is that the leader's not here, which to me speaks volumes. The major governance issue I can see is that the leader is also the finance cabinet member, portfolio holder for finance, and the cabinet member for transformation. It's a combined role. It's like having the Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street also being the Chancellor at number 11 Downing Street. And that, to me, is the fundamental flaw, that political priorities of the leadership have been allowed to override financial sense and prudence because it's all combined in the one role. You wouldn't have got that before because the roles were separated. The risks listed within these reports, it's just really worrying, actually. I thank Adam, actually, for the last couple of slides, I think, of his report, where he went through all the risks around deliverability of savings, uncertainty, the capitalisation direction, etc., etc. And it's just really worrying to me that we just don't seem to have learned the lesson that unexpected events will happen and uncertainty will come to fruition. You know, over the last few years, we've had all sorts of uncertain events. You know, we've had the pandemic, we've now got a cost of living crisis, and we've had other sort of more minor ones, which the council's finances have been in a decent position to be able to weather those storms. And I just don't think they are now, you know, and it just worries me that an unexpected event will happen and, you know, we'll no longer be in a position to weather that storm due to a failed financial strategy over the last year to 2 years. I would just comment, there was talk about the DSG and the accumulated deficit on the DSG and the position around that, and the fact that, you know, the government could hopefully continue the sort of waiver at the end of March. And there was comments about other authorities have negotiated settlements, and maybe we should have some sort of, almost sounded like an earmarked reserve set up to sort of try and balance what contribution we may have to make towards that, which sounds like a great idea, which is why we had exactly that in 2020. We had an earmarked reserve to balance off the deficit because we were acting prudently. That's all gone now because of the last 2 years' poor financial management. But we were in that position, so we didn't have to worry too much. We had to worry about it, but we didn't have to worry that it could present an existential crisis for the council, whereas now it does.
So, Councillor Brennan, I've allowed you to make a lot of comments.
I'll come on to my
questions. I think
questions.
I've got to the limit of comments where I will now ask you to ask Mr. Richard the questions. Not least members, not least because we've got 3 big items on this agenda, and we've already used an hour and 10 minutes of that time.
The 2 questions then are around, firstly, just a question for our Head of Finance, that in February we were warned, his warnings in the budget report included a reference that this council can't go on like this, that our expenditure exceeded its income. A number of us took that on board very seriously. Unfortunately, most members of the administration didn't and ignored that and carried on regardless. So are we still, does our expenditure still exceed our income? Where are we? And the second question is around the capitalisation direction. There was one of the risks was capitalisation direction or asset sales. And just like an answer around why are we looking at changing potentially from capitalisation direction to asset sales, when only a few weeks ago the leader was saying capitalisation was great, the government are going to lend us the money to pay for transformation. That's what I always wanted in the first place, and he seemed to think it was exactly what he was aiming for. Now why are we looking at changing from that? Because only a few weeks ago he said it was great.
So, Mr. Richards, you've got 2 questions there. I think if you'd like to have a go at them, please.
Before I look at those 2 questions, maybe can I just pause and just reflect on a bit of the comments, in the sense that you referenced, you know, thanking Adam Richards and the team for the financial strategy. And I just wanted to highlight that that financial strategy was something that was put together by Cabinet, working responsibly with the Corporate Management Board, with service directors and with services, with regards to ensuring that we had a financial strategy based on tradition and convention. So it wasn't Adam Richards, it was a collective and a responsible approach from the Cabinet was adopted in actually delivering that financial strategy. That was the first one. The second question is, are we still delivering or living beyond our means? What I'm conscious of is in this financial year, we supported our budget by £36 million worth of reserves. If you're using reserves, you're technically living beyond your means in my world. Because we haven't got a £36 million surplus or underspend this year, then the answer is yes, we are. And we roll forward to next year, because next year's budget will assume that, you know, even balance through the way that we've shown, that actually part of that balancing is also utilising the surplus we created from this financial year and the surplus we're creating from the last financial year, pushing that into 23-24, then yes, we will still be, you know, actually have expenditure greater than the permanent sources of income available to us. So you could still probably make that argument as part of that process. With regards to the shift in, you know, capitalisation direction to asset sales, you know, clearly, you know, we have to be respectful of the conversation that's happening with government. The government are clearly, in the letter they wrote to us, encouraged the local authority to actually not draw down on the capitalisation, to look at those alternatives. So respecting the communication from government, you know, reflecting on that has led us into the doing a piece of work to see if it is feasible. We're not saying that we'll definitely do that, we're just doing the piece of work to see it's feasible. And as part of that, we will have to do we make recognition of the fact that there's the overall cost of that borrowing, and compared to, well, if we were selling the assets, what income do we derive from those assets, and compare it to the cost of the borrowing through the capitalisation direction, and work out, you know, actually which is the most effective and efficient way forward. So those are the sort of things that we need to be doing as part of that overall process.
And the requirements of government are contained in the letter from the Minister, which is attached to your last report. Just for clarity to members. Thank you. Councillor Phipps, I think you wanted to come back with a question.
Yeah, would you prefer, due to the time constraints, that I just send my questions in separately? There's a couple of questions there. One of them is about assets as well. So I think it would probably help, wouldn't it? Because we're now at 7:15.
Yes, certainly.
Okay,
And
I'm happy to do that.
I apologise we've got so much on the agenda, but we slotted in one extra meeting over and above next week's. And
I've got one about assets and one about future places, but I'm happy to send them in.
And if in sending them in you could circulate all members of the committee so that Mr. Richards can circulate his reply to all members, that would be very helpful.
I will.
Thank you. I'd encourage that actually when we're short of time. That's a very helpful suggestion. So can I, on behalf of the committee, Chief Executive, did you want to come in? Certainly.
Very, very briefly. So just following a comment from Councillor Cox about the role of the committee, I just wanted to be clear. So I think you used the phrase about holding the executive to account. My sense is that's much more the overview and scrutiny function. Audit and governance function is to provide independent assurance. So I just didn't want to let that wording lie, because I don't think the role of this committee is to hold them to account. It is to provide that independent assurance, which is a slightly different nuance. So that's helpful.
It may be a nuance, but it's still relevant, I'm afraid.
Thank you for that intervention, Chief Executive. And I'm very conscious that we mustn't stray into the work of another committee, which can so easily happen. I will try and guide the committee where I can, but you know, that's important to bear in mind. We're completely focused on the governance issues, and as members of this committee will know, I will do everything I can to prevent us getting into political territory, because it is very difficult to do our work separately from overview and scrutiny if we allow that to happen. So could I thank Mr. Richards and his team for the work that's gone into your presentation this evening, and the issues around corporate risk 9, very helpful. And if other members have other questions in addition to Councillor Phipps, I'm sure you welcome those, and then we'll circulate those as well. And can you make sure, please, that Councillor Brooke is included in this, even though he's being substituted this evening? Thank you. Moving on, if I may, to item 7 on our agenda, which is an update on corporate risk 13, the delivery of the transformation programme, which is going to be made by the Chief Executive. And perhaps, Chief Executive, in so doing, you could just briefly introduce the other members who I think of your team who are online, who I think I will ask you to call up if you want them to add at any particular stage when we get to questions. Chief Executive.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much. And yes, online we have Matty Roudset, who is the Service Director who leads on customer contact and libraries, Katie Lacey, who's the Director for ICT, data, and also runs the Programme Management team, and Sarah Radine, who's the Head of HR and OD. So they're available to take the detailed questions, and I think I will, so I'll call them in as appropriate. And also just to mention that Julian Osgathorpe, who was Director for Transformation Resources, hasn't quite left the council. I think he's on holiday, using his annual leave remaining. So I've picked up this presentation from him. I think he would have done it if he'd have been able to get it in time. But I thought it would be useful for me to really go through a very little bit about what have we achieved through the transformation programme, where are we, in order to see how the governance works. So if this does work, the transformation programme, I think there's probably two real functions of the transformation programme. One of is that it supports the budget, and we will see from this some significant savings coming through, and Mr. Richards has referred to those in the MTFP, and it will also help us to protect and improve frontline services. So supporting the budget by removing inefficiency, removing duplication, leveraging the economies of scale that come out through local government reorganisation, improving the controls framework and improving our processes. So some big efficiency targets for us out of transformation. And it is worth saying that on top of the transformation savings, we can already identify £50 million a year of annual run rate savings through local government reorganisation. So this is not simply grabbing the savings through LGR, the bringing together of three. This is about the efficiencies that you gain further from those. And protecting frontline services, because we know we need to invest in the technology, we need to invest in data and insight and use data much more effectively. My view is that local government collectively has huge amounts of data, uses very little of it in terms of intelligence around services. So I think there's a big job to do in that. Looking at new ways of working and really trying to empower communities, but also empower the way that our people work. And that is a huge shift for us. Also then leveraging our partnerships and working differently with partners, and that's where actually the use of data and insight will be particularly important. And then creating equity in paying conditions. So we know we've brought together 4 preceding councils, 4 sets of terms and conditions. Just about every job that we have, there were 3 previous sets of T's and C's and 3 previous pay rates, and we have to try and harmonise that over time. So that's what the transformation programme in essence is trying to achieve, and it's achieving that through a new operating model for the council, through an estates piece that's really trying to rationalise our use of estates and minimise our use of estates, and then the whole issue around pay and reward and trying to harmonise that. This is by far the most exciting part of the council in terms of what we could achieve. It's also the most exciting transformation programme in local government, and I'll say a bit more about that in a few seconds. So if we did a high level sort of red, amber, green status for the programme, it's the same words as last slide. I would say that we're green, making good progress on the operating model and estates, and we've got a bit of an amber warning around pay and reward, and that's because we delayed the implementation of pay and reward beyond where we thought we would at first. And actually implementing pay and reward in the way that we're trying to has a cost to it, and it's difficult to squeeze that cost into the medium-term financial plan when you're seeing particularly inflation rising. But we do have it now built into our MTFP for 24-25, and again I'll say a bit more about that. But I just thought at a high level, in terms of governance, where would you say our risk is and where would you say we are? We're probably green, and amber. So on each one of those 3, I just thought I'd say, so what have we done? What are we doing now? And what's the next stages? Because that helps to put it into context. So in terms of the operating model, we've been working with our strategic implementation partner, which is KPMG and Agilitas working together, and with our main provider of IT solutions, which is Microsoft. We've got the programme mobilised. We've done a lot of the discovery and design. Now that's all about looking at what we do and how we do it, and of course for every service. I always believe, coming to local government, that most services will run the same way in each council. It's only when you have to merge 3 sets of, I don't know, I'll go back to my roots, environmental health, that you realise that each council does it in a completely different way. and that the probably the differences are greater than the commonalities. So we've had to do that sort of discovery and design for all of our services. How are they provided? What's the information behind that? What's the system behind that? What's the customer contact? And how do we bring that into one? So what we're doing now is constructing that new technology. So particularly, for example, we've done a service redesign, major service redesign in housing. And I use that as the best example because when we talk later on about staff reductions as a result of transformation, housing redesign has come in just about spot on in terms of the percentage reduction of people that we think we need to run the new system as the overall programme has got. Environment is slightly different because environment includes a lot of frontline refuse collection, street cleansing services. There are fewer staff reductions in those frontline services than there are in the back office. So in environment, we've done the same, but we're not seeing the same percentage coming out in terms of potential staffing savings. But I'll talk about those numbers later on. But we've done those redesigns across housing and across environment, and we're getting some really good responses coming with that. We are in the middle of implementing third-party spend program. We've got a structure that we need to implement to give us the capacity to do it, but we can see the ways of delivering the budget savings that Mr. Rittons has talked about for next year. And we're getting in place the delivery of the benefits realisation. And we have to monitor the benefits realisation because the danger is in every service, when they find a bit of saving, they know what they want to spend it on. And we've got to stop the money being saved and being spent all in one move because we've really got to identify what are we saving out of transformation, and then corporately, where are our priorities for spending it? And you know, everybody running every service can tell you where they'd like to improve their service a bit or make it a bit more intense. So we know we have to monitor that and then manage that process. Otherwise, we won't see the transformation savings coming out. And then the key milestones, the key one, and this is probably the biggest individual project, and Katie's probably taking the bearing the brunt of the burden on this, but Sarah has got a huge role to play as well, and so has Adam's team, and that's the finance and HR system. So this is an enterprise resource platform that will bring together our finance and our HR processes, and none of our preceding councils had an effective ERP system in place. They had separate HR systems, and they had separate finance systems. And what this is a bringing together into a single system that links your people and your salaries and your budget, and it provides commitment accounting, and it provides a comprehensive system that will allow us to manage the accounts more effectively. That in itself is a huge project. I've implemented in three of my previous employments, I've introduced an ERP system, and that alone takes most organisations a year or 18 months of hard graft just to implement the new ERP system. We are doing it as one of many things that we're doing across the council. So that is a key project for us, and it's currently scheduled to go live in 6 months' time, just under 6 months' time. I'll just remind Katie and colleagues, just under 6 months' time. A lot of work to do to implement that, but that is probably the biggest single system. And then looking alongside that, the whole customer management system and processes, which again go live Q1 for next year. So two big IT-based projects. On data and insight, we're doing a lot of work, and this is leading edge work, looking at how can we use data. So how can we depersonalize the data so that you can get through data protection, etc., but then use that data to really target our services more effectively. And also establishing the procurement centre of excellence to deliver those procurement savings. So those are end of this year, sort of next quarter, so 22-23, yes, so January onwards. And then the plan is that we then start to see the full-time equivalents, so FTE full-time equivalents. This is the staff reduction, the reduction in the requirement for staff coming through over the next year or so. And I think those savings are baked into 24-25 budget. So we need to have delivered them by March 24, so that's over the next 12 months. Now, we will be identifying through some of the savings that Mr. Rittons was talking about earlier. There will be some jobs that are currently vacant where we don't need to fill those, and therefore effectively taking the transformation savings a year early. But it is only a year early because those transformation savings were significant. So that's what we're doing on the operating model. That's probably the most wide-ranging issue because that will affect every member of staff. So the HR and finance system will affect the way that everybody place orders, pay for orders, do commitment accounting, the way they manage the budgets, and the way that they get treated as individuals, as employees, and their access to benefits and their access to information, things like annual leave. So there's some huge changes there in the operating model. In estates, this is probably easier to map because it's more of a linear process. So we've finished the refurbishment of the BCP Civic Centre, the extension, that's been done. The annex has been done to a slightly lower standard, this building, because we think long term we probably don't need this as space. We started out, I think, with a commitment to provide 4 desks for every 10 employees that needed a desk. That's against an industry standard of 7 for 10. At the moment, I think we probably need 2 for 10. So we're probably over-resourced with the provision that we have generally. And if you walk around the offices, you will find people working much more flexibly, hot desking, paper-free, and actually feeling much more professional in the way they're working and handling it. So we had a really good response from the people that have come back to the BCP Civic Centre extension. A good response to those that are in the annex, but it's not quite as good. And we're hoping to, well, come on to the Old Town Hall area in a second. We've relocated all the staff from Poole Civic Centre, which is now closed. Christchurch Civic Offices is closed. Newfields is closed. Newfields was a really good example where people were saying that the dilapidations bill would be X and it would be really difficult. Actually, we've done it, they've moved, they're operating differently, and the dilapidations bill was about a quarter of what was forecast. So really good outcome from that. We've opened the Christchurch Library and the Customer Services Hub, and I think that's been relatively successful. We've moved the Coroner's Court as an interim into the Civic Centre Annex. So we've done some big major structural pieces there. What we're doing now, finishing off the Town Hall, the Old Town Hall area and the Council Chamber and members areas. We decommissioned Poole Civic Centre, that's been done. The Poole Library actually opens, I think it's next week. And then the Customer Centre moves into Poole Library over the next 3 or 4 weeks. But I went to see that last week, and it's really fantastic. It's made a real difference to it, much more like an area. And there are, and I always get this number wrong, but I think it's about 79. It's over 70 touchdown spaces for employees to work from the Poole Library area. So those people that are based in Poole that only work in Poole, rather than coming to the BCP Civic Centre, can work from there. So we can touch that, and they can do the same from Christchurch. So we're beginning to get that in place now. And we're developing the scope for the next phase of the Estates and Accommodation Programme. But as a result of the savings requirements, one of the things we are doing is looking to accelerate that as quickly as possible. We should not have many office-based staff being outside of the BCP Civic Centre here, or potentially the touchdown spaces in Poole and in Christchurch. So we have a large number of outlying offices. We're trying to close those down as quickly as possible to get the efficiencies out of that. One of the things we are looking at is do we require a 4th potential touchdown space to the north of the council's area? So we are looking at potentially doing that, but that will make us much more efficient. Alongside that, I think it might come on the next slide, I'm not sure, but we've implemented a new car parking charging regime for all staff. So staff that are working in the town centres are now paying for car parking as well. Which matches the policy that Bournemouth Council had previously, and it's been a bit of a shock to those in Poole, but we think we've implemented it in a reasonably fair way, and that seems to be bedding in. And then to come, the opening of Poole, the Dolphin Centre Library and Customer Services Hub, and by the way, if members haven't been in to see it, the new Adult Learning Centre is in there as well. So we've got the Adult Learning Centre, refurbished library, so in a couple of weeks' time, well worth visiting to see some really high quality, outstanding quality services. The Town Hall element should be opening at the end of this calendar year, and then the civic rooms in the first quarter of next year. So a lot going on estates, pretty disruptive to the way people are working, but actually I think we've come through the worst of that. And the bit that's amber, pay and reward. So we've developed common role profiles. We've done that. That's been a real simplification of the role profiles that we used. We've looked at the implementation options, done the consequence of those, had extensive negotiation with the trade unions. We've got a timeline for implementing it. At the moment, we're just looking to see whether we can bring it forward and reduce the upfront cost of implementation, because that's really what the challenge is. So what we're doing now is just looking at those options, and we're reviewing some of the stranded pay issues. So just a couple of examples. We've introduced market factor supplements for recruitment purposes, where we found that our pay is just well outside of the market. So just as an example, in refuse collection, drivers, for example, our assessed pay rate is not what the market is currently paying people, and therefore to employ new people, we've had to introduce market factor supplement. And we've done that on a number of professions where we've needed to. We're bringing a report through to the October Cabinet on children's services and effectively implementing some of the pay and reward early because the agency costs in children are extremely high. So we're looking at whether we can get more people, encourage them to become permanent and therefore reduce our overall costing by introducing what is effectively equivalent to the pay and reward process early. So that's coming through. So we're looking at how we can do that. And then the key milestones to come really are about agreeing that consultation and ballot process with the trade unions. It is an inordinately complex process to go through a regrading of all of your staff. Sarah undoubtedly could wax lyrical on the process, but it's effectively a 9 to 12 month process to get it implemented because there is a need for balloting, consultation, balloting, and if the ballots aren't successful, then you have the option, of course, of dismissal and re-engagement. We would try and avoid that if we possibly can, as you can imagine. So that's where we are on the three key elements of transformation. So it feels like we're at a critical time at the moment, a pivotal point where we move from transformation architecture, how are we going to do this, what are we going to do, to implementation and delivery, and that's where we are right now. In terms of governance, this is a sort of high-level map of the governance. Clearly, Council and Cabinet make the key decisions that are with Council and Cabinet. We've constructed a transformation board. And again, give a bit more detail on that, but that's effectively the corporate management board plus a few. So we've widened the scope. So, for example, Katie has not been on the corporate management board, but does attend transformation board. Matty, the same. So that we've got a slightly wider decision making for the officer group to work within the delegations from Cabinet and Council. And then we have a steering group, programme steering group for each of those three main headings. So that programme steering group meets. And underneath that, there are a number of project teams. I haven't shown all the project teams that we've got, but we've got a series of project teams under each of those programme steering groups, and they meet. Perhaps best illustrated by this slide. And one of the lessons that I learnt from local government reorganisation coming here, which was a really big lesson, was project manage and programme manage everything to the nth degree. And then you will know where you've taken your decisions and what your decisions are. So what we're following through here is a very stringent and detailed programme management and project management process. So those three pictures on the right are not intended to be read, but it's intended to illustrate. The one on the right is sort of an update report on the transformation programme. The grey is a whole series of actions that have been taken, who's responsible, and then the one underneath in blue, green and dark blue is just identifying some of the work streams and how they're split out. So the transformation board meets monthly. It's CMB plus a few. That has delegations effectively directly from Cabinet and Council. And then we have an integrated highlight report, so we get to see the programme overall. Now, one of the things I think that we haven't done sufficiently well is to get CMB corporate ownership of the transformation programme. If I were looking at weaknesses, I would say it's been a bit left to Julian and his team. And what we've got to do to deliver this and to deliver the savings is make sure that CMB absolutely owns everything that's in here and drives the savings out. So one of the shifts I'm looking to, with Julian having left, is for greater CMB ownership rather than leaving it to one director to run. I think that will help us, certainly for the next 6 months, to be really focused on that. And then the programme steering groups would pick up their specific themes and they directly manage all the work streams. They have a responsibility for risk and issue management, and that's clearly articulated. And they have their own risk management processes. And then they generally have a weekly highlight report. So there's real drive on the progress and exceptions on that. And then, of course, the project teams that report weekly into that steering group. So probably won't go through much detail, but there is a very clear and defined structure, and that gives us strong risk management. Key learnings, and just worth talking through this. So I do believe, and Julian absolutely believes, that what we're doing is unique, and it's unique because of breadth and depth. Okay, every council is looking at some aspects of these. Every council is doing some parts of it, but I have not yet found another council that is doing so much. And the reason is we have to, because every one of our services has 3 different systems in place, 3 different ways of working. So we have to revisit that. We have to revisit it. Bear in mind, I do say this regularly, and I'm waiting to be challenged. I have not yet been challenged. We came through the most complex bit of local government reorganisation in England since the late 1970s. We were the only council that has merged 3 sets of county level services. The others have taken a county and split it in half, so they've kept the county policies in place, or they've taken a county and sucked up the district functions. We brought together Poole Unitary, Bournemouth Unitary, and that part of Dorset County Council that covered Christchurch and Christchurch District, and we've merged them into one. So we've had to revisit all of our policies, all of our working practices for every one of our services. And I have not yet come across another LGR in England that has had to do that since, I think it was about 1978. So a really complex process, but that gives us the opportunity to say, how do we take that leap forward then? How do we get to best practice in every single service? And that's why it feels so big, that's why it feels so clunky, because it is, I believe, the biggest transformation programme that I've seen in local government. And the methodology is to try and get us towards leading edge. Now, that doesn't mean you leap straight to leading edge on everything, because there might be some services where we say, well, there is a system that is good enough. But my experience of talking to most of our managers, they say, well, the Bournemouth system's okay, the Poole system's okay, the Christchurch system's okay, but actually none of them are where we should be. And if we leap into this new system, so on planning, for example, we've looked at the 3 planning systems and we're going for a new iteration of one of those systems. So it will be more advanced than any of the 3 preceding planning systems were. Same on legal, we've had the same on housing and environment. So that's what we're seeing, is that leap forward, taking advantage of that. And I have to say COVID, which got in our way a little bit, and I think probably did delay us a bit, but actually has enabled people to think more positively about new ways of working, I think probably has helped us to make that jump forward. So it has impacted the pace and perception of the change, but we have seen a dramatic change in the way that people work and the way that they're willing to work, and that has really helped us to get those messages across. I do want to say that difficulties in recruitment and retention is causing us problems. I think nationally there are pressures on recruitment. Locally, we have a fairly limited pool to bring people in from, and I think that has caused us probably greater pressures on some of those services. And it is worth saying the impact on staff is huge. Yeah. So if you had a new ERP system coming in, people would be uncertain. How do I book my annual leave? How do I do my flex time? How do I do all that? They've got all of that, and they've got new office accommodation and new working arrangements, physical working arrangements, and they're having new system working arrangements in their service. So it probably is the most unsettling time that you could imagine for staff, because everything is changing around them. So we have to recognise that. We have to keep communicating. I would say our communications needs to step up a little bit more. I think that's one of the issues where I would say we could do better, and make sure that is really being communicated clearly across with all our staff. But people have moved from their own desk to a hot desking working environment at the same time as knowing that a whole load of other things are changing as well. So I think I certainly want to pay tribute to the way that people have come through that, because it has been challenging. And I don't want to go into detail on this slide, but this is a slide that just shows, people always say, so are you going to see the benefits? And we've budgeted for, I think it's about 500 and something FTE equivalents being taken out of the council. What we've identified is how many people do we need to run the council in the new guise, service by service. So this gives you a sort of a summation of how many people in each area. So just to pick one at random, in the middle of children's services, you might be able to read it, there's 207 FTE. We've added all those up across the board. We think that comes to about 3,938 approximately. That's actually 843 fewer than we've currently got. So when people say, will you be able to hit the 600 target? Actually, that's where I get confidence from, because we believe that we might be able to go beyond that. I'm not saying these are the numbers we're going to live to, but when you do that pass through, you can see a greater level of reduction than we currently have. Now, one of the things we have to be careful of is if we reduce any services, that reduces the potential to introduce efficiency. So we've got to make sure we're not double counting between savings and transformation. But that slide gives me a lot of optimism that there is potential, and we are still on track to achieve the savings that we've baked into the budget. So I use it as a bit of reassurance. We only got that slide together over the last few weeks because we've begun to finish that job. So that's where we are with the transformation programme. And in terms of governance, it is complicated because the programme is complicated, but I think it's relatively strong, and that gives me confidence that the risk, which is in the corporate risk register, is being managed effectively. So that's the presentation. Happy to take any questions and very happy to bring in the three experts as necessary.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Executive. That was comprehensive and extremely helpful. We obviously haven't had sight of the slides, and some of us are somewhat challenged in seeing them on the screen, I have to say. So if you could circulate them, I think members would appreciate that. There's an awful lot of detail in there, quite necessarily. I don't intend to bring in the other officers unless you call them in for a particular question. So members' questions. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. It was very interesting and enlightening. I have to say the biggest concern I have at the moment with the transformation is that the guy that was running it and responsible for it has left, effectively. And you know, a lot of us on both sides of the political divide are pinning our hopes that this works. And the fact that he's gone is of some significant risk, at least, to the fact that it will work. And so I suppose I want to know who's in charge now. Is that you? So that's the key first question. The other question you mentioned early on was that there's already £50 million of savings baked in. And I'd like to see an analysis of that and see where that 50 million is. Because the concern I do have is that there's been some double counting of savings. And you kind of, you actually mentioned that you're concerned that savings might get double counted in various places. So I think it would be interesting to give us some sort of reassurance that there isn't some sort of double counting and that they are there and that they will come.
Can that be supplied?
We can certainly supply that, and I can also answer the question in terms of accountability. Yes, it's me. It always has been me as Chief Executive of the Council. If you took the previous arrangement with Julian as Director of Transformation and Resources, my sense of that was it was absolutely right for creating the architecture and the design. Question for me, this is the real challenge: is it right for implementing the benefits, seeing the benefits coming through? And what I think we should achieve now is the Corporate Management Board has to own that, because the savings are not going to come from the transformation programme, they're going to come from the implementation in the services. And actually, in a sense, by not having Julian in the organisation, we can put that responsibility fairly and squarely on the service directors, the corporate directors, and me as Chief Executive. So Corporate Management Board has to step into that space, both collectively and individually.
Mr. Richards.
In regards to analysis of the 50 million, it's actually £47.9 million as set out in figure 8 in the 22-23 budget report. So the analysis is there. Okay.
Are you done, Councillor Cox?
Not quite. Okay. Is that so?
No.
I hear what you're saying about Julian's position, but you know, I suppose I want a further reassurance that the Corporate Management Board have bought into those savings, that it's their responsibility, and that's the key, because this guy's created it and has left, and so it would be very easy at the moment if it doesn't happen to turn around and it's his fault. Rather than taking responsibility for it as it is. So that was just one bit of clarification. The other bit is you mentioned that about, I think it's effective finance and HR systems and other councils that can you name some that they have taken place? Because it would be a reassurance to know, you know, other successful councils. I don't want you to quote Thurrock, not Northampton, because you know that wouldn't be good. So, you know, some successful councils that are using these systems effectively would be some reassurance.
Chief Executive.
Thank you. I forget the honest answer. Be most councils have an enterprise resource platform. Many of them use Oracle for finance and HR. That's an integrated enterprise resource platform, or they use SAP, which is the other. So those are the two big ones.
Welcome back, and apologies for the unforeseen interruption that we've all had to suffer. We are on questions on item 7, the delivery of the transformation programme. Questions for the Chief Executive only, because the rest of the staff who are online have now been stood down. And we're quite a long way into questions. And I'm trying to recall actually whether you've just finished answering, Chief Executive. I think you probably had.
I think I had, Chairman, but if there was anything outstanding, I might have just bought myself time by the file I'm going off, and I do apologise because I'm struggling to remember what I hadn't covered. I think the only issue was around Corporate Management Board, I think, and their ownership. But.
Sorry, that was one question. I think I was actually asking for successful councils that have gone into this combination of finance and HR systems that I wanted some reassurance on as well.
And just to reassure the council from my personal experience, and I will mention Thurrock because up to 2014, when I was running Thurrock Council, it was a well-managed council with a balanced budget and had come out of an improvement programme. We implemented a new ERP system there. I also managed London Borough, Barking and Dagenham, and there were 6 London boroughs came together and formed an Oracle consortium and introduced an ERP system there as well. Actually, when I was at the Her Majesty's Land Registry, I implemented an Oracle ERP system there. So it is, it's the way that most big organisations operate, and it will definitely give us huge advantages and huge benefits, including, as I say, things like commitment accounting that we haven't got in full functionality now.
Okay, thank you. But just one little more question, if you don't mind, Chair. With the pay grades, you said that there were some significant differentials between pay grades that we were paying and what they had to pay locally. And having recently had a dispute with a bin driver, I just wanted to know, when you upgrade their pay, do you do some sort of analysis of how good they are, for instance, and are they worth that money? Or are you just giving them a pay increase?
Chairman, if I may, not on an individual basis, but of course there is an ongoing assessment of people's competence, and if there is any concern about individuals, let us know and we'll investigate those. We do regularly, receive complaints about individuals and investigate those, not necessarily in that service, but in all services.
Thank you. Any other? Councillor Howell.
Thank you, Chair. I have two main concerns about transport transformation. Firstly, is that a suspicion that what we're doing is creating a system that is primarily benefits the software provider, the owner of the system, the consultancy or whoever is going to be managing the system, providing the system, and that officers will become data entry people and be focused on maintaining the system ahead of supporting residents. Now, obviously, that's an exaggerated situation or presentation, but there's an underlying fear there that what we might end up with is not an innovative system, not something that can change and adapt to the needs of residents, but something that really is a kind of system that becomes static and serves its own purposes. I mean, an example of that is that we heard from the Chief Executive that Poole Library is reopening this week, which is great, but I'm a Poole Town Councillor and I've not been informed of that. So if we go through the whole of these transformation systems and the council is still as bad as it's always been at informing councillors about what is happening in their wards, then we're not making much progress forward. My second point comes into whether we can really trust transformation, the savings and what it's going to deliver. And the external auditors report in the next item suggests that the reporting mechanisms are not sufficient, the scrutiny is not sufficient, with the transformation process. And I don't know whether the Chief Executive would like to address that here or in the next item. But to give an example, the budgeted savings for this year are £8.7 million. And I made some inquiries of the Chief Finance Officer and discovered that the software and related costs that were involved in transformation for that year, so like the licenses that you would need to secure and pay in order to run the solutions that are delivering the savings, amounted to £3.4 million, but they were not set against the savings target. So in reality, the savings would have been 5.3 and not 8.7, and that kind of discrepancy or misleading kind of presentation of figures makes it very difficult for us as councillors to be able to assess whether transformation, is going to deliver. Thank you.
So, Chief Executive, a number of points in there, and I appreciate Mr. Richards may need to help with the final one. Would you like to try and respond, please?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks. The first bit about our staff going to become data entry, well, they will have to do some data entry, but actually the whole purpose of the data and information section is to try and make sure that we collate the data so that we know who our customers are, because somewhere in our systems we know who lives where, what address they live at, we know some of their history, and we know whether they're council tenants or not. We need to pull some of that information together, and that will reduce the amount of first point data entry. The other is that modernising the systems will also allow us to encourage and enable many of our customers to do self-service. So I always give the example of the green bins. In green bin registration, you can go onto the system, put in your postcode. If your postcode is one of ours, then the second challenge is, do you have a credit card from which we can take £60? And if the answer to that is yes, then we will provide you with a green bin and it will be delivered and it'll be collected. So you can do things thereby cutting out a lot of the data entry that many of the staff will have to do. So that's some of the efficiency. But what we've been really clear about is we're not cutting out any of our existing channels. We are going to encourage people to use digital channels, but that will allow us to put more resource into dealing with those that can't. So we've made it very clear that we're not closing points of access. You still have the points of access to come in and request a service or do it by phone or do it by letter or however you want to do it. But we're encouraging more people to go digital. So I think there's a slight misnomer in that. I do, Paul, library reopening, I must admit, I just thought that had been well publicised. I will take that back and check with the comms team because I thought that was in some of the emails recently. I'll check on that because we do need to be making sure people are aware of these things, because actually that Paul library is going to look fantastic. It's made a real difference. People that have seen it have said, wow, it feels very different from the old layout and the old structure. So we do need to value that. The point about trusting the reporting mechanisms, I'm wondering if I could just take that away and come back to you, because we have a huge amount that's spent on software and hardware at the moment. We will be spending that in different ways. So it may be a replacement cost for existing infrastructure costs. It might be a replacement for ongoing maintenance and license fees. I don't know, but let me go back and just take that sort of challenge and work with Adam to have a look at that, if I may. My sense is that the savings have to be real, otherwise the medium-term financial plan doesn't balance. So as we see those savings being driven out, that's the point of making sure that we have to identify the savings and don't allow the savings to be eroded by new spend. Otherwise, we will not see the savings coming out. And the decision on where to spend extra money is not for the local service officers to take, but for politicians to take through the budget setting process. That's what it's one of the huge things that the councillors contribute is the budget setting. And if we just take it and strip it and spend it on somebody else, then that's taking away the power from the democratically elected council. So we should not be doing that. I wouldn't support us doing that. I think.
Adam, would you like me to send that email change to you? So that we had a communication about this earlier, just for convenience. I don't expect an answer now, but
no,
just
in the sense that I don't need you to send me the email, Joe, because clearly I think I sent it to you in the first place. I think you accurately reflected to it. I think you've got a commitment with the chief exec to actually look into it and respond at a later point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Brown?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a short question around the pay and reward element of transformation. Obviously, a lot of it's about transformation, the associated savings, but pay and reward comes with a cost to it. Just in terms of how that fits in with the medium-term financial plan, is that being taken into account in the medium-term financial plan? To what extent? Is it clear what that cost will be?
So we have modelled it and we've built it into the MTFP for 24-25, but we are looking at that. So that was based on a particular model of where you pitch your desired salary level against the market, and whether we go for a spot salary or a range. And that was pitched at spot salary at, I think it was the comparison with public sector outside of London plus 3% to be just above the market norm. That's where that was pitched, and we've got that built in. But we're looking at alternatives for that. So the real cost, the implementation cost, comes when if you've got 3 people on 3 different grades and you've identified the middle grade as being the right one, the person who is paid above that, who has to reduce their salary, doesn't want that to happen today. Okay, they need notice of that, and in most of our agreements we've got, say, a year's notice before people get pegged down in terms of salary. But if you are being paid below your evaluated grade, you want that money now, and therefore you end up paying the increases now but not seeing the decreases for a year, and that's the bit that costs primarily. So we are working through different solutions for that, trying to look at where people go. Do they go on to the 100% grade, or is there a grade, so 100% spot salary, or is there a grade? That's what we're trying to work through to find ways of implementing it. Because for the staff, the number one issue now that we've resolved the car parking is pay reward. It probably was number one before car parking as well, but that is the number one issue for us to address.
Councillor Phipps?
Just quickly, did you want to comment on what I asked before? Basically, and very quickly, the cost started off with the KMG report at 30 million, they're now at 67 million. The rewards or the benefits don't seem to be, the cost savings don't seem to have changed. So actually, we're not going to be, how do you interpret that?
Okay, so it's a very easily, and I think we can send you a note that shows this. So for most part, it's not additional cost, it's charging more to the transformation programme. So you'll be aware that in the budget report, I think it was this year, it might have been last year, we agreed to put roughly £6 or £7 million per year for 3 years of ongoing costs against the transformation programme. So they effectively get charged into the transformation programme rather than being seen as a revenue cost. That's probably the biggest chunk. In addition to that, we have identified some opportunities in both adults and children's to really transform it, and we've put extra funding in there. And for that extra funding, we do expect to see extra return by way of savings. And that takes, I think, the 44 million target up to 50 million a year or thereabouts ongoing. So there's two parts that I see that have moved. The first part is the capitalisation or the charging of costs into transformation that would otherwise be revenue costs. The second part is the additional spend and focus on children and adults, for which we will see greater return.
Chief Executive, just 2 quick questions, if I may, and they follow through from what you've just been saying. The first is around pay and grading and all that goes with that through transformation. Can I take it that there is constant and repeated dialogue with trade unions, and that is by officers and by members? That's my first question.
Yes, I can absolutely assure you about that. And we now have a quarterly joint consultative council JCC in place with the leader and members of the cabinet meeting with trade union representatives alongside officers. So that is there. The bit I haven't really focused on is alongside, of course, the salary level is the whole terms and conditions piece as well. And we are rewriting the terms and conditions into a single set of terms and conditions, whether it's, one group by tradition get a half day's leave at Christmas and the other groups don't, through to how many days annual leave they get and what additional allowances, standby allowances, etc. Consolidating all of those as well. That is absolutely being done in consultation with the trade unions.
And I'm assuming, therefore, that the timetable of meetings is to with their agreement, so that they aren't feeling disadvantaged in that process. Just having been through pay and grading and on the member side led on it, it makes a huge difference to be able to informally have those discussions outside of any formal network, and I think both sides benefit immensely from it. My second question is with regard to, if you like, the transition into the delivery stage of transformation. You mentioned that obviously other officers are now onto CMB for those issues and are therefore able to take ownership of them, which seems to me a logical way of trying to get this developed and delivered. Did I take it from there that with Mr. Osgothorpe leaving the authority, that transformation is now within your purview? And my question, I think, is, will that on its own, given how much there is in terms of the delivery stage, be a distraction from other parts of your work? Because it is a substantial piece, and I'm sure you've got all the capability, but I'm just concerned that that might then mean that other things don't get quite so much of your time.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think the only answer at this point in this scale of transformation programme is that I have to lean into that. I think that's the phrase that people tend to use these days, isn't it? So I will be leaning into transformation a bit more than previously. That does mean I've got to rearrange my diary and rearrange priorities. But actually that comes with a commitment from all the members of the Corporate Management Board. And bearing in mind we have a number of members of CMB that were not here when we designed the programme. They've joined more recently. They all came in absolutely committed. You know, they had a full briefing on the transformation programme, and they have sort of reiterated that commitment to delivering it. So yes, absolutely, I do need to lean into that, and we need to look at use of my time. But equally, we have that commitment for the members of the Corporate Management Board as well. So it is a collective effort, not just an individual effort. And I am, of course, just considering the senior management structure and where that is and what that might look like longer term. And I'll be coming forward with some proposals on that relatively shortly.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Audit and Governance, can I thank you, Chief Executive, for your presentation and for the degree of detail that we've had. And could you convey our thanks to the officers who were online but actually never got the chance to participate, and apologise to them for that and for them standing them down, but I think it's the right thing to do. So, members, we have one further item on the agenda, which is item 8, which is the External Auditor's Annual Report 2020-21, and that's the value for money report. Good evening, Mr. Barber.
Good evening, Chair.
Mr. Barber is partner at Grant Thornton and our external link for our external auditors. And my apologies for keeping you waiting. It was beyond our control, I'm afraid. But I'm sure that members will be very keen to hear what you've got to say on this particular report, which has been circulated with the papers. So if I could pass over to you, Mr. Barber, to introduce the report, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, committee. So probably just to start, just to remind members of the committee that our role as your external auditor is twofold. It's an opinion on your financial statements, and it is separately an assessment of your arrangements as a council for delivering value for money in the use of resources. So this report, the auditor's annual report, is for 2021, and it sets out our findings in respect to that VFM role. And it requires us to conclude on whether, in our view, you do have proper arrangements in place for ensuring economy, efficiency and effectiveness. Now, VFM means different things to different people, but from an external audit perspective, it focuses on 3 areas. It focuses on financial sustainability, governance and improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And we have to give a judgment against each of those 3 areas. And for each of those 3 areas, we've set that judgment out on page 15 of your papers, the executive summary, and I will talk shortly, with your permission, Chair, to each of those areas. I am conscious that it's getting quite late, and it is a detailed report, but The detail in the report reflects the new NAO, National Audit Office code, that requires me to report more comprehensively in each of those areas. So what we sought to do in this report is capture a balanced assessment of your VFM arrangements. It does focus on the financial year 2021, but I am conscious that we're now in 22-23, so we have sought to have regard to the developments that have taken place in the council in the intervening period. I will take the report as read, but I will, as I said, talk through the main conclusions. But probably, just for clarity, I wanted to start by referring members to Appendix C in my report. And I'm just going to find the page number, the big number on the left-hand side. So this is page 55 of your papers. And this essentially sets out the different type of recommendations that can arise from our VFM work. And there are three levels. The most serious type of recommendation, and the one that you should have greatest concern about, would arise should you receive what we call a statutory recommendation. And I think it's fair to say that we reserve those for the most serious concerns that we have regarding arrangements at an audited body. Importantly for you, there are no statutory recommendations in this report, and we are not making any for BCP for 2021. They tend to be the nuclear option, for want of a better description. They are rare, but they're not unheard of. And actually, interestingly, they're becoming more frequent. So I think earlier today we've talked about some of the councils that have had challenging situations. You know, some of the ones that have had statutory recommendations from us as Grant Thornton include Slough around financial capability and reserves, interestingly. Sandwell, where there was a real breakdown between relationships between members and senior officers, and Warrington springs to mind as well in relation to investment property accounting. But there are separate reports that capture all those. So that is the most serious type of recommendation, and importantly, BCP don't have any of those. The next level down are what we call key recommendations, and these arise when on balance we conclude in one or more of those areas that we do not think a council has effective arrangements in that particular area. And you will see in this report that we've made a number of these key recommendations. So there are 4 in total. 3 of them relate to the financial sustainability area, and 1 of them relates to the economy, efficiency and effectiveness area. And as a result of those 4 key recommendations, we are essentially concluding that we don't think you have appropriate arrangements in place for financial sustainability, and we also don't think you have appropriate arrangements in place for ensuring economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and that is a concern. Now, given the seriousness of the financial challenges facing the council and the issuing of the 4 recommendations, we would expect to see significant improvements in arrangements going forward. And ultimately, if we don't see that, then there is always that risk of that statutory recommendation. And I will reflect at the end of this presentation on what I've heard actually earlier this evening, but also some of the things I've seen over the last 6 to 8 weeks in response to this report and some of the findings. In addition to those 4 key recommendations, we've made a further 10 improvement recommendations. These are also important, but they are the lowest level recommendations, and they're more to do with refining and improving arrangements that are already in place and are not as significant. So that's just a bit of background context in terms of the recommendations. If I take each of those areas in turn now, if I start with financial sustainability, this is detailed on pages 24 through to 32, but the summary is set out on page 15. And financial sustainability from a VFM point of view and the auditor's point of view is all about your ability to plan and manage within your limited resources and continue to deliver services. It's about how you balance the books into the medium term, and we appreciate that's not easy. I do concur with Adam's point earlier about the challenges facing all councils. All councils to varying degrees are struggling with delivering balanced budgets. It's austerity that's been going on for a long time. You need to, I think Adam mentioned the revenue support grant. That was a very large source of funding many years ago. It's almost completely dried up, and you're reliant on council tax and business rates, ever increasing expectations of your public, increased demand for services, increased costs, and that's been referred to earlier this evening. And the cost of living crisis invariably means that residents will rely more on the public services. So those issues face every council, and for any council, it is very hard. And what it really means is that councils' financial plans are being tested and stretched like never before. I suppose my reflection is, in addition to that, BCP has additional challenges. It's compounded by the challenge that you have, and the chief execs mentioned this, about bringing 3 predecessor councils working practice together, bringing those arrangements into one streamlined council to take advantage of economies of scale. So demands on your services are changing, and therefore in doing that, you also need to re-engineer the way that you do things to ensure that those services are now providing and reflecting the changing needs of your public. So you have to transform. The council has to transform, and that requires time, and it costs a lot of money. Without upfront investment, you cannot realise those savings. So you need to effectively implement this transformation. You cannot balance the books by doing things at the margins. You need to spend that money, and you need that money to be able to spend it. And that's really what I think the crux of the issue is. How are you going to finance this expenditure required to transform? Normally, it would come from your revenue streams, but clearly the government recognises that all councils to varying degrees need to transform, and therefore it's provided incentives and other options to fund it, including the Capital Flexibilities Initiative, where you can generate capital receipts from disposing of assets and use that capital to fund revenue costs that are purely about transformation and not about ongoing service delivery. Now, your transformation, as has already been mentioned this evening, has increased significantly. The cost estimate has increased, and that is, yes, in part down to an increase in scope. And all that funding was initially predicated, as you will have seen and no doubt will know, all that funding for that transformation was predicated on, it was innovative, but it was very high risk. It was a high risk strategy for that funding of those revenue costs through the Capital Flexibilities Initiative. The Capital Flexibilities Initiative is not high risk. If you sell an asset, it's quite straightforward if you're transforming. The way of generating your capital receipt, a large one via the beach huts, was very high risk. And obviously, in due course, as we all know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, that was eventually prohibited in September. And now the funding for this significant transformation programme is heavily reliant on a far from certain capitalisation direction, which is also inherently risky. Now, it's important to say that I, as the appointed auditor, are not advocating a risk-adverse approach for council decision making. It is ultimately for the council to make their own informed decision. We do recognise that the financial challenges you face require councils to be brave, and you do, and all councils do. They need to accept a degree of risk. They need to be risk aware and not risk adverse. But if the inherent risk increases, it is critical that you have coherent alternatives that are fully developed and that you're able to enact should that risk materialise. Now, I think that the council threw all their eggs into one basket, so to say, and despite the noises, and there was unease for some time from DLUC regarding the use of the flexible capital receipts at the council, you continue down that route with no lower risk alternative implemented or available should you be unsuccessful. And I suppose our concern now is that having had the beach hunt initiative pulled, the council's embarked on this alternative, equally risky strategy. And even if that is approved via the capitalisation direction, it's not a badge of honour. If you look at the councils that have received capitalised direction, they've had serious problems, and it does come with significant restrictions and additional obligations. Already you're required to do a governance and finance review by the end of this month. You know, if you were to borrow this money, and if it was approved in part or whole, you know, you would get it by PWLB, Public Works Loan Board. Those rates are increasing significantly. There's a surcharge on capitalisation directions, I think, of 1%. So there are financial consequences that need to be repaid from revenue. That would be a minimum revenue provision charge every year. So there are absolutely ramifications. You know, the Director of Finance is absolutely right. If you did sell assets, I realise that there are ramifications to that as well. You know, if they're assets used to provide services, yes, that can have effect on service delivery. If they're assets held for investment purposes, there may be a lot of revenue streams. You know, you might lose out on capital appreciation. So there are pitfalls in all options for funding this transformation, but it has to be done. So I do say in the report that at the time of drafting it, there were no viable alternatives to the capital direction, you know, and they hadn't been developed. I have seen a number of the cabinet reports that have been issued over the last 6 weeks. So I had a quick look through the financial strategy that the Director of Finance referred to that's going to cabinet next week. And I do note that now for the first time I'm seeing savings, I'm seeing efficiency plans. You know, I can see that they're detailed by line, which is, I think, very promising and shows lots of good signs. But I don't underestimate the challenge of actually delivering them in practice. The ability to deliver savings after so much austerity is really, really hard. And there are some pretty large numbers in there. So I think there is still a very big ask, but I have seen some real progress in coming up with alternatives, as I said, over the last 6 to 8 weeks. That said, on the basis of looking at what we've looked at in terms of financial resilience, we do, at the moment in this report, conclude that we don't think you've got arrangements in place for financial sustainability, and we still have concerns over the budget, balanced budget for 23, 24 and beyond. And on that basis, we've made 3 recommendations, and these are set out on pages 19 through to 21. So I just wanted to briefly run through these. So the first one was all about, which I've just referred to, about the urgent need to identify options to balance the book into the medium term, should the capitalisation direction not be realised in part or full. You know, and this is all about scenario planning, what changes can be made to services to make savings, to generate efficiencies, to grow income, and what would be necessary to enable the council to balance the budget. You can see the response from management to that recommendation, and clearly we've already referenced some of the information that did go to cabinet at the end of September and will be going next week. The second one is in relation to the disposal of assets. Very rarely, based on what I've seen, when a capitalisation direction is issued, very often there is a big challenge back to the council as to whether there are any assets they can dispose of to generate capital receipts that can be used to fund transformation. So that it needs to be pursued as well, and I know that there is work going on to see what options are available in that area. The third key recommendation, which has also been touched on earlier this evening, is in relation to this increasing cost of the transformation programme. It has gone up considerably, and I appreciate that associated savings are increasing in terms of the projections, but from an external audit perspective, it has often been difficult to be clear on why the costs have gone up and what changes that means in terms of benefits realisation, in terms of financial benefits and qualitative benefits, and actually the timeline for implementing and realising those financial and qualitative benefits. And I suppose for me, I believe that there needs to be clearer milestones that can be used to ensure that the council remains on track against its programme, and if there is slippage, that reactive action can be taken to bring it back in line or understand why it's happened so that lessons can be learned for the rest of the transformation programme. So those were the 3 main recommendations on financial resilience. No doubt there will be questions in respect to that area, but I just briefly, Chair, wanted to pick up on the other VFM areas because I don't think that will take anywhere near as long. A particular relevance to this committee, governance. Now we've set out our details in relation to governance on pages 34 to 36, and we've identified some areas for improvement, but generally we were reasonably satisfied with governance arrangements, and we do think that arrangements are effective. Clearly, we do attend this committee and we see the challenge that this provides, and this committee plays an important role within the governance structure within the council, as does your internal audit function in terms of internal control, risk management, etc. In terms of the third area, the 3 E's, there was some lots of good stuff in here, but obviously the thing that we've focused on in our report is the area of children's services, and you will all know of the concerns that have been raised by Ofsted based on their visit back in November 20, and I think they were in again December 21, and basically resulting in the area being rated as inadequate, your arrangements being rated as inadequate. I recognise a board has been set up and lots of things have happened, but there continue to be concerns raised by Ofsted. And when we get any adverse inadequate rating by Ofsted, that immediately results in that particular VFM area being assessed as not effective. And on that basis, we have concluded that the 3 E's areas is not an area of effectiveness for the council for the year concerned. Chair, I've probably gone on too long there, but I'm probably minded to stop there and take any questions from committee members.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber, and thank you for your report, which I think has had significant impact, certainly across this committee. I would hope it has across the wider council as well. So I'll take questions. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a few questions, I'm afraid. Well, if I deal with some of them, in terms of the financial sustainability, I think your report is virtually spot on, and I thank you for that because it's highlighted clearly where we've been going wrong. But one question I would have is that you've come up with 4 major recommendations there, and there is an opportunity to do a public interest report, which I think you've set out in that page 50 something that you mentioned earlier. And why haven't you done that? Why haven't you? Because this is a serious matter for financial sustainability. So why haven't you made it more serious than it currently is? So that's kind of one question. But I think you've identified what a number of us have been saying for some time. But what that leads me on to really is the governance issues, and it's the governance issues that I feel most strongly about. And I have to say, it's the governance issues where I feel your report falls down fairly badly. If I just go into a few areas, you talked about a lack of information. I don't know if you were aware, but effectively scrutiny of this council was silenced by reorganisation by the administration of scrutiny. Was that good governance? Opposition spokesmen were stopped from being briefed by officers. Was that good governance? We ran down our reserves and created dodgy schemes. Was that good governance? And we've got significant unders and overs which didn't go analysed. Was that good governance? And I think if I take you back to the comments you made in 2021, your report quite clearly set out some actually quite complimentary comments, because I remember them vividly, of the previous administration. That we've mentioned them actually in this report, where that administration reacted quickly to the pandemic and dealt with it very well. And so, question I would ask you is that did that change of administration from a prudent administration, which you've referred to a high risk taking administration, which you've referred to, was that part of the problem that have led us to this position? But one of the key points I want to make of yourselves is in terms of the beach hut saga itself. because quite clearly you've said here that you knew what was going on. You knew what was going on. So what advice did you give on that to tell them not to do it? Because clearly a lot of the people were trying to say you should not do this. Well, how complicit was your firm in actually allowing that to continue? I've questioned our own complicity as a committee in this, and so I do feel that if you were aware of it, which you were clearly aware of it way before we were aware of it, we weren't allowed to see these KPMG reports, and is that good governance? The fact that opposition, or actually not just opposition, all councillors were not allowed to see these KPMG reports. We were banned by the leadership from seeing them. Was that good governance? Because it's clearly not. And so how you can turn around in this report and not criticise governance of this council, I'm staggered by it, to be honest. And so, I think I've probably said enough, so I've probably got more to say, but I'll finish.
Thank you. So could I ask Mr. Barber to respond, please? Very difficult to respond to so many without losing some of them along the way. Sometimes less is better. But Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll try to go through those in order. So I think you asked about, Councillor Cox, about the public interest report. I think actually in my intro I was referring to the different types of recommendation, and the nuclear option, for want of a better description, being the statutory rec. I don't think, and I'm clear, and I've consulted on it with technical colleagues, that the council is in a position where all is lost, and that the concerns are so severe that a statutory rec would be appropriate. You will have seen in my report that I have indicated, and I did in my presentation, that if things don't, if we get to, dare I say, the budget setting process that is ultimately approved at full council at the end of Feb, and there are serious concerns about the ability for the council to balance the budget into the medium term, that potentially could trigger that position, alongside, as the Director of Finance has indicated, potentially the risk of a Section 114 in terms of his role. But at the moment, I am absolutely comfortable that the key recommendations are the appropriate level to go into. That these should not be underestimated. I am concluding that, in my view, the council does not have arrangements in place for ensuring financial resilience, and that's what the key recommendations refer to. So I remain completely comfortable that that is the appropriate level of concern to raise via that recommendation process. In terms of governance, now governance for me is all about informed decision making. It is not for me to comment on the democratic mode process for making decisions. All I seek to see is that there is a process for providing information in a way that enables those decision makers, cabinet in the main, to make a decision based on complete and accurate information. It is for them, as the voted democratic decision makers, to make that decision themselves on what they believe to be best. Now, what I do is, when I look at governance, I look at things like the annual governance statement and the comments in there. I look at the work that internal audit do. I have a look at the head of internal audit opinion that is generally positive. Clearly internal audit look at internal control, risk management, all those sorts of areas. And I see things like the committee that myself and Sam attend. And I think that the information flows, inevitably there's scope for improvement, but generally the information flows work, and that information is made available to those that need it to make those decisions. In terms of the suggestion about the beach hut, which I think was your third point, I've known about the beach huts for some time, because I have regular catch-ups with the leadership team, including the Director of Finance, and we have that relationship where we can discuss issues at the early stages. It is absolutely not, and I think you used the word advice, it is not for me to advise the council. That is completely outside my role. That ethically, I shouldn't have any role to play in any decisions or anything that's done by the council. I deliberately make sure I don't advise the council on anything. All I do is I make recommendations and I provide challenge. And I provided challenge to the Director of Finance in relation to the beach hut on a number of occasions, spent an awful long time sitting down with him and colleagues going through this, and challenged the use of the capital flexibilities in what areas it could be used. I also challenged the beach huts, and as you may already know, although the proposals were at the margins of the guidance, actually my interpretation was that they do comply with the guidance, which was the same advice that was received by the council. And I told the council that although I thought it was high risk, I did believe that it complied with the guidance available at the time on the use of capital flexibilities. DLUC contacted me, I spoke to them as they did with the council, and they clearly indicated to me that they felt it wasn't in the spirit of the direction, but they realised that it was for them and not for me or the council to pull out. It was for them to clarify that, which they ultimately did in September. My main concern was that that was known about by the council for some time, and despite that, they carried on with no plan B, for want of a better description. I'm not sure, Councillor Cox, if I've covered all your points there, but I'm hoping that's most of them.
Councillor Cox, does that cover all your points?
It covers a number of them, and thank you very much. And you've certainly clarified, and I'm delighted that you did challenge the beach huts, because I wouldn't have expected anything less, to be honest. I don't really see you challenging them and giving advice that it's not a good thing. Is totally much different. But what is quite clear from what you've said is that you're not interested in governance of this council. You're restricting that definition to basically what information the cabinet had to make that decision. And you're saying because the cabinet had that information to make that decision, it's fine. The fact is that everything before that, the way it got there, the way that any other councillor, not just the opposition councillors, but other councillors, got to hear about these some of these decisions, got to challenge some of those decisions, you're not interested in, which I'm disappointed in, I have to say. And so I really do think that the governance of this council is shockingly poor because of that. And the fact that the administration, which you have quite clearly identified in your report, was a high risk administration, and it's quite clear from your report that the failures of the financial sustainability have gone from virtually excellent, or not excellent but good, to shockingly poor. It has come about because of that change of administration, and the changes that they have made to the governance arrangements of this council has contributed to the arrogance that has taken place in how these decisions have been made, and that's why we're in the position that we're in. And I fear that you've given them a free pass by not calling them out on governance, because governance is very important, and I'm disappointed, I have to say, that you haven't been harder on the administration. I would expect you to be hard on any administration, not of any colour, not bothered about the political side of it. This council has failed, and it's failed in its governance to have allowed us to get into this position from a relatively comfortable position, which your previous report had mentioned. So,
Mr. Barber, I'm sure you'll want to respond to the points raised by Councillor Cox, and I think, bear in mind that this meeting is live streamed, it's essential that we hear your response to those points, because otherwise they rest as made. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so as you probably expect, I completely refute that entirely. I think that's a complete misreading of the work we've undertaken. I am absolutely comfortable with the work that we've done to arrive at the view in relation to the governance of the council, and clearly we, myself and Mr. Councillor Cox, on this area disagree.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it'd be remiss of me not to sort of comment on this part of the report. I I am interested in your take. You said basically there's pitfalls in all options that we've got here, but what I would I'd add to sort of Councillor Cox's points about failings in governance at BCP Council, which is sort of what we need to really pay attention to. I'd add to the points he made about the point I made earlier about the combination of the leader with also having cabinet responsibility for finance, audit and transformation. Is that good governance? I don't think it is. I think it's shockingly poor governance. And despite most reports being in his name, the failure of that cabinet member to attend virtually every audit and governance meeting that there's been during the time he's been a cabinet member for audit, finance, transformation and leader of the council. Is that good governance? I think it's shockingly poor governance. I think it's indicative tonight that the leader isn't here. There's no cabinet member for children's services. There's no cabinet members, and the only members of the administration are here are sitting there not talking and looking at their phones most of the time, not paying much attention. I think the governance is shockingly poor in this council, and I think your report needs to pick up on that. I'm disappointed that, like you say, there's pitfalls in all options. Your report is black and white in my, as far as I can see, or really sort of black and red. You know, it starts off, and I'm pleased where it talks about the previous administration's financial arrangements, having been the cabinet member for finance during that administration. And I think it's quite clear what you say. You start off by saying this council and its legacy authorities have historically performed well with a record of strong financial budgetary management. And I think that goes for Poole, Bournemouth and Christchurch councils before, and for the time of the Unity Alliance. I think that changed significantly 2 years ago. That prudence has been replaced by high-risk strategies which are now failing. And in your words, there are now significant weaknesses in several areas, and we've got these recommendations. I think it's quite clear where the rot set in and what's gone wrong. And I just think, you know, the public need to know that. They've come up with 3 plans now. They've come up.
This is part of the problem, isn't it? Because you're just questioning the fact that
Councillor Cox,
you're not actually asking any questions.
Councillor Cox, any comments will be addressed through the chair, as you very well know. Now, Councillor Brown, I've given both you and Councillor Cox, I think, quite a lot of flexibility this evening. I understand the point that you're making, but have you finished, Councillor Brown? Can I ask, as a result, can I ask our external auditors to comment on the assertions that you
just comment on that, and again on why there is no real strong criticism of the governance failings that there are in this authority at the moment.
So, Mr. Barber, various comments made, again, because this meeting is live streamed and they will be on the record. I'm sure that's perfectly intentional, but I would like to hear from you, as our external auditors, your response to those comments, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, there was reference to various issues there from Councillor Brown. I mean, in terms of how a cabinet, how committees are set up, who sits on what committee, the roles they play, that, you know, there is a framework in which decisions are made within every council as set out in the Constitution. I am not aware of any breaches of the Constitution in terms of any decision made within BCP. And as I said, and I will refer to my previous comment with Councillor Cox, that, you know, having looked at the arrangements overall, that is my judgment. It may well differ from others, but that, as your independent auditor, that is my prerogative to make my judgment. You know, the comment about the financial resilience and the timing of it, my reflection is that there are difficult challenges that need to be made. You know, I do come across some councils where they're sitting on huge amounts of reserves that they've historically had, and they can make the poorest financial decisions in the world. They can keep all their money in the bank and make absolutely nothing from it, and still deliver all their services, and they're in that very lucky position to do that. Do I think they're making the right decisions? Should they all be sitting in the bank making no money because it's public funds? Should they be risk adverse? That is their prerogative, and if they deliver their services, so be it. When we come to a situation where councils are struggling to provide all the services for the increasing needs of their public, And given the funding regime in place for local government, and the Director of Finance has mentioned, you know, the forthcoming budget at the end of the month, and the potential funding for local government going forward, it is inevitable that councils have to look for different ways of providing services. And we see lots of this, setting up companies, wholly owned subsidiaries, alternative service delivery models. We see all of these. Some of them are very successful and bring huge benefits to councils. Some of them fail catastrophically, and lots of them form somewhere in between. But that is what they've had to do. They've had to look at alternative ways of doing things. And I understand that councils need to be innovative and try different things. That is absolutely what has happened here at BCP. My concern is about the management of the risk of that. If you're taking on increased risk, there needs to be absolutely further controls introduced and alternatives, and a decision made on what you will do as a council should that risk materialise, if you're accepting it and not mitigating it. And that is all to do with the financial comments that I've made, the financial resilience comment from Councillor Brown about the change from 2021, from 1920 to 2021. Clearly, when you were formed from the three predecessor councils, you inherited those. It was obvious that you were going to have to transform, because that was the only thing. Now, in terms of actually funding that, there wasn't an immediate solution in terms of your reserves and the way of funding that. So clearly, what you would have to do a combination of lots of things to do it. What you've done is you've sought this beach hut solution and potentially the capitalisation as being the panacea, the complete solution for the whole transformation programme, which may well have worked if it had been funded in that way, may not have, I don't know, but it's not come to fruition, and there is risks associated with the latest strategy. Well, and what I'm saying is I don't think that is a sensible way to progress in isolation without having alternatives available should that approach not come to fruition. I've probably gone off message slightly there, Chair, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber. Councillor Howell.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions, but I'll deal with them one by one. First, I'd just like to point out it's nice to see an accountant's report that is appropriately dated. But the first question relates to this issue. It's a timing issue as well. You've said, I think, that the flexible use capital receipt beach huts proposal was high risk, but you've also said that it fitted within the guidelines when you assessed it. Now, I remember standing up in our budget meeting in February and pointing out that it wasn't in the spirit of the regulations, and that the government could change those regulations if it didn't like them. So I want to understand from you is at what point it became high risk, or was it always high risk, and did it increase up to an even greater risk at a point where the government started to query this? And at what point, because you did mention that the council didn't take action quickly enough once the government started to raise concerns about this, and at what point did the government start to raise concerns?
Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and I might need a Director of Finance to assist in terms of the exact timings of this. But all I would say is I was advised about the proposal early on in the process by the Director of Finance, and spent a lot of time looking at it and discussing it with various members of the council, and also with DLUC in terms of their views. I expressed my views that this was a high risk strategy, but I also, following quite detailed reviews of the technical nature of the proposal, did come to the view that actually what the council were proposing to do did fit and meet the guidance issued and available to all councils by the department at that point in time. I did emphasise the need to ensure that it demonstrated value for money, because obviously it's involves disposing of an asset that is a valuable asset, and the risk and reward and all those sorts of things. And you know, I know that the council did go away and do further work to demonstrate that, and then clearly through publicity, DLUC, Department of Levelling Up Housing Communities, got involved and spoke to us, and that's when it was clear that they were uncomfortable with it being in the spirit of the guidance. I was aware of that, the council were aware of that, but ultimately it's not for me to tell the council not to do something. That is absolutely not the role of the external auditor. I can challenge, I can highlight, audit's a retrospective exercise. I will comment if they don't make the right decisions, and that's what I'm doing in this report. But it's not for me to ensure that the council does X or Y. That is the decision of the council.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So that sounds to me as if what you're saying is that you thought it was always high risk because although it was technically in the spirit, there's always the possibility the government might come back and question it. And when they did come back and question it, obviously it became higher risk. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Okay. And could we know what the date of when DLAP questions started questioning and raising concerns?
My understanding was that DLUC started raising questions in March, this is from memory, after they were contacted by a councillor of this councillor after the budget process. So that's when they started to raise it with me, and subsequently raised it with me. As Pete Barber has said, they raised it with the external auditor, then it went quiet for a bit, and then we had engagement on their formal response. But I think the point that the external auditor makes through his response is there was no plan B. And I think even in that budget, when we discussed the budget for 22-23, I can remember the then chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee making clear statements to say that the Section 151 officer was clearly advising that there is a number of red flags or red lights flashing all over the dashboard. That was something that he was making, and he was concerned, and I think the committee endorsed it, was that there was no plan B. And I think that's clearly one of the key issues that the external auditor is reflecting back to us.
Okay, and it still took about 6 months to actually, after the concerns were raised, to actually start producing plan B. I said literally when we were told not that we couldn't do plan A.
Clearly, it's going to be an interpretation of what Plan B actually looks like, but clearly the work that's been undertaken by the Cabinet over the last few months with those monthly reports, I think is a quantum leap towards delivery of that Plan B that everybody probably saw from the beginning.
Okay.
Councillor Howell, you had 3 questions.
Yes, okay.
I'm not sure, are we on the second one? Or
The second one, it relates to transformation funding and the sale of assets, which is recommendation 2. You refer to the possible need to sell additional assets, but we didn't. So that implies that when you did this report, some assets were known were known to be on the programme to be sold. So you must have had a list of assets that you were given. We can't discuss exactly what assets because it's restricted information on the current list that's going to the Corporate and Community Committee next week. But I'm interested to know whether whether the assets that are proposed to be sold have increased in number. And I'm also aware that quite a few of those assets are assets which had previously been earmarked for regeneration. So there's nothing in your report, as I can see, that discusses the consequences for the regeneration programme, and whether, the knock-on implications about whether future places in that programme is now viable, given that assets are being taken away from their funding stream. Is that an area that this report should have looked at?
Barbara?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so I think my recommendation, I think it's recommendation 2 actually, and my comments about capital disposals was more in respect of having seen where requests for capitalisation directions have been made elsewhere by other councils. It is not normally my experience that a council will be given a capitalised direction in isolation and just been and told, yep, you want 70 whatever million, off you go to PWA and borrow the full lot. They will look, the government will look to ensure that the council has clearly sought alternative sources of funding before it relies on a capitalisation direction, and it will often insist that the council generates an element of the funding through capital disposals, asset disposals. I'm not citing on which there weren't. To the best of my knowledge, there weren't any real large amounts of capital disposals planned when I was doing my review. Clearly, on the back of this report and others, that has gained pace, and the Director of Finance mentioned a number of assets that potentially could be disposed of even before the end of this financial year to fund some of the transformation work. But what I was saying here was, you can't just wait for the capitalisation direction response to come back from government. You should proactively be realising that they inevitably may request assets to be disposed of, and if that is the case, you need to be able to go back to them with what assets they will be, and that was why I made the recommendation about understanding what assets you could dispose of, because to varying degrees, getting rid of any asset has consequences for service delivery and or revenue generation.
And your third question.
The third question, just related to, you've said it's a governance issue. You've said that there's no real issues with governance, but you've also said that we need more openness and clear reporting in the transformation process. So I'm wondering, what is your advice to the council as how they can get to a situation where they are actually reporting to the standards that you would expect? And because as you were listening earlier, I was raising this concern that it is a lack of transparency, and it's difficult for councillors to be able to assess where we are with transformation because of the way it's presented. What are your thoughts there?
Mr. Barber?
Yeah, well, it is interesting because initially, if we go back to the beach huts and that funding of potential funding of the transformation programme using the flexible capital receipts initiative, part of the requirements of the capital flexibilities initiative is that a council before the start of any financial year has to set out how much of its budget is going to be funded from capital to transform, and it has to talk about how much it's going to spend, and then when the year finishes, as part of its close down reporting, it needs to reflect back on whether it's delivered against what was set out in the budget. So I think that provides actually quite a neat reporting mechanism for any transformation, where at the beginning of every year you say, this is how much we're going to be spending on transformation. This is how it's going to be funded. This is the potential benefits that it's going to generate in terms of cost savings, increased income generation, qualitative stuff. And then at the end, at the very least, that is reflected back on to find out whether that was delivered against that, and actually how you delivered against those those in the business case for that year. And ideally, my view is, given the size of the transformation programme, that happens more frequently, and that there is a running total against the original plan. And that's the important thing, because how can a third party understand any slippage or any non-delivery of savings, or the savings not being realised to the extent that was expected, or those sorts of things? That is fundamental to understanding how well that significant programme is performing. And I couldn't see that in that degree of clarity in the external reporting within the council that's available publicly.
Okay, so I kind of lost you a little there.
Sorry.
But you're saying that the accounts that are currently produced are sufficient to be able to, that they're an outsider to be able to identify things and not be confused.
There's a huge amount of detail. I mean, there is massive amounts of information that forms the transformation programme, that it goes to different forums and, the board, etc. I'm interested in what's out there externally that's available through, public reported minutes and documents and meetings, particularly, just as you would report to Cabinet, on the outturn for the performance of the council overall. I would expect, given the nature of the transformation programme, that there would be more detail at a higher level that sets out those key metrics and performance, both qualitative and quantitative and financial.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber. I haven't had any other members. Councillor Phipps.
Okay, I think it's a good report. I agree with it. I have a simple question, really. Do you agree that your report shows an extreme decline in the financial sustainability, the governance and the efficiency and effectiveness of this council from the previous year?
I do, because last year we did not give a significant weakness under financial sustainability. The 3 E's were significant weakness last year and this year. And when I say the last year and this year, you need to have regard to the fact that actually we're talking about 1920 and 2021 here. And one of the things we will be looking to do is ensure that the 21-22 VFM report is delivered in a more timely manner than this report.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Well, that's a separate discussion which is recurring through audit and governance. I'm sure we'll touch on it at our meeting next Thursday. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Just one quick question. Thank you very much for the work you've done on this report. Very good report. All the cobwebs blown clear, and your position as an outside auditor made very clear, which we should all know and understand and appreciate. Just the one question I have, a very straightforward one, with this report, and from what you've said through these questions, or just mainly one question been asked several times, is that you're confident of the process that's happened, that's been laid out, and you're happy and you're confident that this is looking like we're on track and we will get there. From the position where we're at, from what we've heard from Mr. Richins, and from your report, that you're confident that we're sailing in the right direction. Thank you.
Mr. Barber.
Yes, really, thank you. Yeah, I don't think I would say that I'm confident. I think that far from that, I've said that I've seen over the last 6 to 8 weeks a clear shift in focus of the approach to budget setting for 23-24 and beyond. I think there's an awful long way to go, and you've got some significant challenges ahead of you in the area of financial sustainability.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber, and thank you for your presentation and for fielding so many questions, as well as ably supported here by Mr. Richins. I'd like members to turn to the recommendations in the report, which are for noting, but I think for the record, and because we're live streamed, I should read them out so that any members of the public will be aware of what we are noting. And it's recommended that the Audit and Governance Committee notes, firstly, the delay to the completion of the audit of the financial statements, and secondly, the findings, recommendations and management comments in relation to the value for money arrangements. Members, can we agree to note? Is that agreed? Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate that we've gone on a bit longer because of the unexpected interruption earlier on, but I thank you all very much indeed for staying the course, and I close the meeting at 9:17. Thank you very much.